full-time sorted. So really this is just kind of reinvigorating our LPD program. Early on we did some LPDs, and then we kind of had a break, and now we're just kind of getting those started. Work with battalion commanders, we kind of broke the LPDs that we're going to do from now until we all leave and potentially pass on to our successors, breaking it down to three large categories. One, tactics, your typical aerosols, your fires, your defense, your offense, and topics like that. And then on other LPD sessions, do it more like whole Army, looking at kind of systems, whether we're talking into if the Army's rolling out a new program, rearm, training resources, things like that. And then the final group is really whole of person. And it's really things that are applicable to us in the Army, but also kind of are broader and have an effect on your life, leadership, things like that. For those of you that know me, probably not that surprised that this is the first one we're doing. I became somewhat fascinated with this video. Initially, it really came from coming into the brigade and realizing we had 12 suicides in one calendar year. And then looking around and stepping right into the blender that you guys have been living long before I got here, seeing all kinds of indicators of burnout and just soldiers getting kind of pushed to their limits. And I don't know if you're similar to me, but I had never really been impressed with any of the things that the Army had done as far as like suicide or resiliency. All the resiliency training I'd ever gotten was really that, hey, resiliency gets up. Resiliency helps. But I hadn't really had a single LPD or session, post-suicide, post-whatever, where I felt like I'd gotten anything other than suicide is bad and that resiliency is good. So I went and started looking outside the Army for kind of new, something slightly different. Stumbled on a video that I've tortured people with since I came into command. And when I watched the video, I kind of felt like it was much more consistent with my experience and much more consistent with kind of just, I'd always been left with the kind of sense that while well-meaning, everything we were doing as far as suicide went was actually somewhat counterproductive. For suicide, depression, resiliency, all of those things. And I found this was much more consistent with kind of how I felt about it, and then talking to other people who kind of got similar feedback. Question whether or not they were just telling me what I wanted to hear, or if they agree with me, but I took it in this case. Then as I kind of dug more and more into this, went to the guy's book, read some of his articles, and realized that it actually had much more far-reaching implications. And as I'm sure you guys kind of came across, the real premise of this book is that you're not really looking for creating happiness just to get rid of depression or for the person's general well-being. That the truth is, happiness actually leads to success, whereas the conventional wisdom is that success leads to happiness. But there's a lot of research. Most of it was social science initially, which is always taken with a grain of salt because it's self-report. But then as I dug more and more into more of the hard science and the kind of neuroscience of the whole thing, realized that what this guy's saying, I actually believe that when you look at the brain chemistry and everything else, that happiness ends up putting you in a position where you're going to be successful as opposed to success leading you to happiness. Are we straight and good with everything? Yes, sir. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into this because each one of these things is kind of covered in a principle. But throughout this whole thing, I plan to interject at different times and talk and encourage you guys to. If there's something that kind of stood out for you or something that you see that may or may not have been hit by the person doing it, because we're all going to take different things from it. The point of this is to have a conversation. One of the main things, and the author kind of talks about how knowing something is one thing, but putting it into practice is a completely different thing. The real intent and purpose behind this is less about us all walking out of here understanding these principles better. It's really so that we can take these principles describe how we see it inside of our organization, and then really spend the majority of our time talking about how we can take these things and actually put them into practice. Because I've read and I've listened to this video so many times, I've talked about it tremendous amount of time, but I don't actually do any of these things. I don't journal, I don't write about the 3 gratitudes, I don't do a lot of those things. So we can just try to figure out as a group how we can make these things actually occur in our unit so that we can actually harness and leverage the benefits that he talks about. Okay, so first is Ward. Yes, sir.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Ted. For those who don't know me, I'm Ward 3. So I will very briefly touch this slide. The boss mostly covered. The thesis or the premise of this book is just that happiness is the precursor to success, not the other way around. So the author, Sean Archer, is a 12-year veteran of Harvard University. He wrote this book and one other, and he's known for his TED Talk and his tours where he goes around and he talks about his 7 principles, which we'll discuss today. Like the boss said, the challenge here is bridging the gap between science and implementation, and then doing it in your personal life. His method, again, he spent 12 years, 6 of which was at student status at Harvard. The other 6, he was some sort of professor/researcher. He kind of stumbled on this by accident and then dug deep into it and thought it was worthy enough to publish a book, and a lot of people have bought into it, which we'll talk about today. Slide, please. Okay, so principle on the happiness advantage. What is this really all about? So you have to start by defining happiness. You could obviously look in the dictionary and give you one answer. The author proposes it's kind of this formula. So pleasure plus engagement plus meaning comes to this human flourishing, which actually came from Aristotle. From there, he gives another possible definition of certain words that maybe scratch the surface, like joy, gratitude, serenity, awe, love. Everyone's going to have a little bit different value or feeling of what happiness means to them, but we're going to use this as kind of a jump-off point. And so in this first chapter, he starts out strong by giving some scientific evidence for where he's coming from, and he starts with the idea of nuns. So there were some professors about 40 years ago who got their hands on a collection of diaries of nuns from the beginning of their commitment into the sisterhood all the way into their deaths. And they said, hey, look, I wonder if their attitude had a difference in the way they lived their lives, in the length they lived their lives. And so they got their hands on over 100 of these journals, and they found that the nuns who were generally happy at the beginning of their training and who had positive journal entries and were excited about the future, not only lived 10 years longer, but seemed to have more fulfilling ministries and more fulfilling lives. And so they said, okay, there might be something scientific here to putting happiness in front of success. And so they said, all right, well, let's do another study. And they took a bunch of people and they kind of queried a room. They said, hey, how do you feel today on 1 to 10? They had this study built out that helped them kind of gauge what happiness was. And once they had an idea of who felt what way, they then introduced them with, purposely, a strain of a cold. And brought them back in a week later and said, okay, how do you guys feel now? How do your symptoms look medically? And what they found was those who were happier at the beginning of the study, who had a general positive outlook going into this infection, recovered substantially faster than those who had a negative mindset going into it. And so they said, okay, there's something to happiness. It's obviously effective, but what is it and how do we ascertain it? And so they did another study. It's the jello you'll see there. And basically what they found was it doesn't take a lot to change your mindset and have immediate impacts on what you're doing on a daily basis. So they took a bunch of kids and said, hey, we're going to ask you to do this puzzle. Before we do that, just know that we've got this jello. And if you think back to that jello you just ate and how happy it made you, think about that for about 30 seconds. Okay, great. Now do this task, this simple task. What they found was the kiddos who had jello and thought back on something as small as jello an hour before they ate it did substantially better than peers who didn't have jello, didn't have that happy memory to reflect back on. So it's this idea of priming before you go into an event, thinking back on something positive and bringing it forward. The author also talks about something as simple as like listening to a funny clip for 2 minutes before you go into a stressful brief. Or making a phone call, talking to someone that you love for a couple minutes before you go into that QTV that's, got you sweating bullets. Further evidence is give the doc a lollipop. And so what they found was they took a bunch of doctors together and they had control groups, and they said, all right, some of you doctors are going to get no lollipop, and some of you do get lollipop. You can't eat it till you're done, because I don't want to change your blood sugar levels and throw off my experiment. But when you're done with this, you can have lollipop. And something as small of a reward as a piece of candy had a 30% impact on how fast doctors were able to diagnose and properly diagnose an illness inside a pack. And so what the author found was that it's very small things, a small memory, a quick phone call, a quick video, a small reward that's waiting on you can have a positive influence. Slide, please. Okay, and then his premise, really, in chapter 1 is that happiness is work ethic. So everything else he's going to talk about for our 7 principles kind of come down to these 8 things. And so these are techniques he said you can employ. Some of them work better for others, and some will employ them all. The first is meditation. They found through various studies that as little as 10 minutes of meditating in a day can have profound impacts not just on job performance, but on your health. And so they did long-term health studies in individuals who meditate, and they found that that's extremely beneficial. Something as simple as having something to look forward to. And what he mentions is, it doesn't have to be right now, it doesn't have to be that lollipop I can have in an hour, or that instant gratification. It can be as simple as, hey, I'm going to run that marathon and I'm going to do it next summer. And if that's something that motivates you, gets you excited, it could be several months out, it could be a year out, but it's just something to kind of press on and look forward to throughout the day. The third thing is random acts of kindness. And I thought that was kind of a cool rock. I still on that online. But it's got to be intentional, right? So it's the author mentions like going through a toll booth and paying someone's toll behind you, or picking up someone's tab at a drive-through at Starbucks in the morning. But the key is 3 to 5 of those things in a day that you've thought about, you've put work into, have the opposite effect. And not only do you make their day, you make your day. The fourth thing is just manifesting positive thoughts. Hey, I can do this, I'm going to do this. And then PT. We all do PT in the morning. I think we all feel the impacts of PT. Most of us do PT several times a day over the weekend because it has an effect on the way we think and the way we feel. Another principle the author mentions is this idea of spending money, but not on things that are instant gratification or even high-end items like a luxury watch or that pair of Air Jordans that you just have to have, but experiences. Right? And so whether it's traveling the world or taking the team out to lunch, something that allows you to look back on a memory and say, wow, that was really fun, that was a really good investment of my time and my money. And the last thing is find a talent, exercise a talent every day. And so, kind of anecdotally, something I've stumbled on that's kind of silly. When I was a kid, music was really big for me. I played several variations of the saxophone, I played the clarinet, I was on the drum line, I dabbled with the piano. And then somewhere around my junior year in high school, it kind of went away. I had other priorities I hadn't touched in a while. But my daughter for Christmas got a toy keyboard from her grandma, and so during bath time I found myself jamming out on this 2 sets of keys, and it's actually been really fun, and it's kind of re-sparked some stuff, and I'm like, man, I should go get a keyboard, I should do that. And it's just a way for me to kind of release, and it's been enjoyable. But the author suggests all of us have several hidden talents, and the more you exercise those talents every day, the more likely you are to have an all-around happy face. And so, why this matters to us is everyone in this room controls the climate, not just in your organization, but all the way up through here inside the division. And so we are the thermometer, or the thermostat when we're a thermometer, right? So the way we act and react and interact matters to the troopers around us. We set the tone. If we are unhappy people, likely our organizations are going to follow behind. And so there's this concept of the Lozada line. And what this is experiment into how managers or bosses or command teams interact with their subordinates. And so there's this idea that it's not what you said, it's how you said it. I don't know if anyone else in the room is guilty of this, but my wife has said that to me several times, right? It's not just what you say to me, it's how you're saying it. So what Lozada found was that you need to have a 3-to-1 positive comment to negative comment ratio from leaders to have a successful business climate. And so businesses that have a lower than 3-to-1 ratio between leaders and led in terms of the way they interact with them tank quickly. And they've gone in, Lozada and the team have gone in and invested in a lot of companies and consultants. They've seen how these bosses are interacting with their people, changed it to a greater than 3-to-1 ratio in terms of positive reinforcement to negative, and it's been almost overnight, within a month, reversal within those organizations. So the way we say things matters, right? We have lines we have to hold with our troopers. but you can't just sit there and be a jerk about how you say it. So the Fortune 500 dug into this, they've invested in this, and they've got several ways that they can implement this. Not only the 3-to-1 rule and these 8, kind of principles inside happiness being worth ethics, but also do things like bringing a dog to work. Like Google is famous for having started that. Virgin Mobile said the key to Virgin's success is our employees' happiness, right? They invest heavily and make sure their employees want to show up in the morning. You see things like foosball tables, spas that employees have access to, even the 10-minute get outside and walk around rule. So that a lot of companies will encourage their personnel to get up, leave the office, go outside, see nature for 10 minutes, come back and kind of reconvene. And there are several others. The point is, this is something that's been implemented, I think, at a higher rate outside the Army than inside the Army, and to a lot of success. Slide, please. Okay, so that's a brief synopsis of kind of what Chapter 1 is. And so what I thought was we go by row here, the intent being a fairly intimate dialogue of 3 or 4 troopers per row. And we're going to kind of look at these 5 questions. We're going to take about the next 5 minutes to discuss within those groups, which I'll assign here in a second. Then we'll come back and kind of have a dialogue as a group of where we're going. So for the first row, I wonder if the Army's retention policies and kind of where we're at right now with retaining soldiers has to do with happiness. And by that I mean individual soldier happiness. I think it's obviously broader than that, but I wonder if that has something to do with it. And if it does, what can we do at our level to start better reaching our troops? That'll be for the first row. For the second row, I would ask how we can help our soldiers better flourish. So remember, it's that pleasure plus engagement plus meaning. And where should we start? Is it at work? Is it at home? Is it with understanding the trooper? For the third row, we're going to look at 3 to 5 daily habits that have helped you achieve happiness, right? So he gave 8 daily habits you can do between random acts of kindness, PT, etc. Are there any outside those 8 that you implement that you've had success with that you'd like to bring to the table? For our fourth row, are there any other principles, actions, or TTPs not listed in this chapter that you've seen our units, or maybe you worked at a company before you joined the Army, or you've done a lot of research on this, maybe you have a master's in it, that could help all of us as a team bring this to our organization. And then for the fifth row, what are the 3 to 5 things you'd like to implement within yourself and within your unit going forward, so we can bring this out to the force. And then we'll repeat, right? So row 6, intake, question 1, row 7, question 2, this side, on the wings 3, this side 4, then command teams are free to discuss. Right?
Just before we kind of jump into this, a couple things just to kind of highlight. Just kind of the brain science behind, like he makes this assertion and then he gives all kinds of evidence of how being happy leads to more successful people. He's got the nun example, he's got the doctor's example, and all of those things. But kind of the science behind that, because I'm always a little skeptical of just straight social science, is he's hooked up like electrodes to people's brains, and he's kind of done functional MRIs, if you're familiar with that. And the thing that he's really kind of discovered, which was most convincing for me, is that if you're in a negative kind of frame of mind, there's a certain part of your brain that lights up. And then if you're in a positive frame of mind, there's a portion of your brain that lights up. And what he's found is the 2 parts of the brain can't be active at the same time. And if you remember the Amy story from either the video or from the book, he kind of talks about his younger sister falling off the bed, and he knows that the jig is up for him, but he's already been threatened by his parents to play nice because he broke his sister's arm by knocking her out of the way of an imaginary sniper bullet. So he knows as soon as she screams that he's done. So he immediately throws out to her that she might be a unicorn. That's what she wants more than anything else. And she instantly goes from screaming to being excited and then scrambling back up onto the bed to kind of talk to him. And that is probably his first experience with what he later proved in the functional MRI, is that there's these 2 different centers and they both can't be active at the same time, and they're separate and distinct. What he's also found by kind of going through this is the part of the brain that lights up when you're in a negative state is the part of your brain that is largely responsible for like baseline functions. It's your fight or flight portion of your brain, and it's also associated with dumping cortisol into your body. And if you know anything about cortisol, cortisol has all kinds of negative effects, both on your brain function, both on your mental or your kind of psychological state, and on your physical state. The part of your brain that lights up when you're in a positive mood is your prefrontal cortex, and that's the more evolved part of your brain that's responsible for creativity, problem solving, developing strategies, innovation, creativity, all those different things that we're looking for soldiers to do. So what he's really stumbled on is the fact that in a positive state, the part of your brain that is engaged and is active is the exact same part of your brain as you want active in your soldiers. The part that's going to be able to identify a problem, develop a solution, and then actually be able to implement that solution. And that's where this whole thing of happiness actually leads to success as opposed to vice versa, because we've got soldiers in the right frame of mind, or employees in the right frame of mind for them to actually be able to engage in that higher kind of function. The other one is, why do we need to practice? Because he talks about all these different practices. And largely society is going to bombard you with a bunch of negative things, whether you're looking at news, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on whatever you're doing, the focus is generally on the negative because that's what sells and that's what resonates. The truth is, our current state as a society, as a world, is diseases are being eradicated, poverty line keeps moving up. There's less armed conflict in the world than there has been in any other time in history. There's all these positives, but you never know it based on kind of what you're bombarded with by society, by media, and everything else. So that's the portion of our brain that is most frequently engaged, and it's the one that gets the most work out. And that's where the neural pathways and the plasticity and everything is naturally pushing you. So the whole thing with practice and those things that he's telling you to do is because that part of the brain and those pathways are the ones that are less used or less utilized. So it's all about starting to build that so that you will have that pathway be stronger and you're more likely just to gravitate towards there. As your neutral state is going to be more positive and keep you in that prefrontal cortex rather than hanging out in your limbic system, which is it's great for if you're attacked by a tiger, not so great if you're trying to solve a complex problem. So that's kind of where he's going there. And then, as this applies to us, he talks about the dotted line. And like the minimum you're looking for is a 3-to-1 negative feedback, or positive feedback to negative feedback. In the Army, where do we think we hang out? 1 to 3 is probably a wild overestimation. And it's just the nature of our profession. But understanding this kind of research, we have to start to acknowledge the negative impact that has across the organization and figure out how we can start readjusting the feedback that we give. I mean, we go to an AAR and we phone in the things that went well, and we focus almost exclusively on the things that we did poorly. And there is a reason for that, and I'm not recommending that we necessarily change it in an AAR style format, but we need to understand that if that is where we hang out in like the AAR, then outside of the AAR, we need to go into overdrive for kind of pushing the positive things that are going on. We'll have 420 soldiers show up on time and 1 soldier show up late. All we're zeroing in on is that soldier who's late. So just figuring out how we kind of rebalance that. And then one thing here, he talks about the Fortune 500, and he gives a lot of examples of different things they're doing. And I think that's fine, but in my opinion, we don't need to like replicate that. Because in my opinion, they're focusing on the cheap one. If you look at the pleasure, engagement, and meaning thing, they're focused exclusively on the pleasure, and it's like the cheapest one. Whereas in the Army, I think we have the opportunity, and something we need to talk about as part of this is how do we stress the engagement and the meaning. There's all kinds of different ways that we can try to get our soldiers more engaged, where we talk about buy-in all the time. And then how do we kind of impress upon them the meaning of their profession? Because if you're just focused on the pleasure and kind of talks about this, and a drug addict is focused completely on the pleasure, I don't think the average drug addict is necessarily what we're looking for. It's just focused strictly on the pleasure side of happiness, whereas I think we need to be leveraging the much more deeper core engagement. I mean, I've had some pretty horrible times, but believed in what I was doing, and I think as a general rule, that's made me much more happy with my career choices and the things that I've done. So as we look at this, focus less on pleasure and more on engagement.
Yes, sir. So let's take about the next 5 minutes. I'll bring us back together at 7:10 to discuss these topics. There's some pretty lively dialogue going on. Let's start with the first row, and it's gone. And the Army's principle of retention / is it a happiness problem? What you guys kind of talking about? So, go ahead.
Sir, I think what we discussed is that the problem is really twofold. So the emphasis should really be placed on job satisfaction when it comes to retention. So I think soldiers are not not finding a purpose of meaning what they're doing, and therefore they're not happy. I love my job. I'm happy. It's that simple. I think what we can do to actually remedy this issue is overly communicating to soldiers at their level, like, hey man, here's why it's important for you to go, schedule your demo, because if you don't do so, this happens to the company, this happens to the design, this happens to the creator. So if they understand the big picture, they understand what's at risk, or why you're showing up to go shoot, last minute, it would be a little bit easier. Like I said, so job satisfaction will lead to happiness.
What about row 6? Any hot takes on agree, disagree?
I'll talk about it for a little bit. We talked about similar thing, but kind of built off of it. Like one of the challenges I think we all face in this room is that most of our soldiers that we have now, they signed up for a war that's basically over. It's kind of like the war that you guys fought, our soldiers saw and signed up for. So me and my first sergeant were kind of talking about if they signed up for a war that's kind of waning, then we obviously have to get them ready for the next one, but soldiers usually don't admit to us that they have a good time at a CTC rotation or have a good time during Memorial PT until it's over. Like, no one looks forward to that, but they all tell stories about it. No one tells stories about Rear D, whether you're at the southern border. No one tells stories about, Rear D from a combat deployment. So I guess the last part that would kind of tie that together is most soldiers, they say they're the happiest when we give them time off, but Rear Ds have kind of the most time off, right? When you're downrange wherever, you're working the most there, and that's when we at least have seen soldiers the happiest. And that's, I think, because of purpose, which is kind of what you guys talked about. And I think the economy is going to kind of band-aid the Army's retention problems. So the Army's going to get some weird feedback, some non-scientific feedback on all these new initiatives they're putting out. And I don't know. I think the solution's more here than it is in the Army pushing out policies that maybe give soldiers time back or extra whatever it is. But money helps too, so they can go spend it on stuff. And that's how we feel.
And that'll tie into one of the later principles we were talking about, the money versus the kind of the calling side of it. But kind of building on one of the things too is we talk about op tempo all the time and how that's killing morale. But the truth is, during the war on terror, especially during the surge period, those of you that were in know that the op tempo was significantly higher back then. But there was the difference was back then there was a meaning. So I had a high op tempo. Families were being asked to sacrifice tremendous amounts because of the deployment. You had friends that were dying. Your spouse had friends whose spouse had died. It was incredibly stressful. But
the Army weathered it relatively well because there was this meaning. I was defending freedom. I was bringing freedom to people. I was defending our country. And right now, we're in this state where we thought that after the war on terror, there was going to be this significant dip in op-tempo. But because of the shift the Army has kind of gone through, where it's less about the fighting and it's more about the building partnerships, and we're deterring Chinese and Russian aggression, at least the theory, that we were doing that through building partnerships and things like that. It kept the op-tempo up, but it was a much more abstract purpose that we were achieving. It's very hard to explain to a soldier that going away for 6 months and bouncing around the Pacific was having an effect on China, as opposed to deploying to Afghanistan and taking the fight to the guys who had blown up the Twin Towers. So we had this op-tempo that was very high, but meaning very high, and understanding of the purpose that you were achieving. And now we have this harder to see meaning, but the op-tempo hasn't changed. So I think you're on it with as far as what's really causing the dip in morale and how we can kind of build it up. So the trick is really how do we work that and try to provide that meaning. And then you kind of talked about how your morale is high, you're happy with your job and everything else, but the target population in this case, do they have the same level of engagement that you have? I mean, as a company commander, you're engaged every day. You're shaping things. Yeah, you're dealing with a bunch of crap, but your level of engagement is significantly higher. You also understand the big picture better, which you can translate to meaning. So how do we take that and provide the engagement to more junior soldiers and provide the meaning to junior soldiers? Yes. So it's you engaging with them and you helping them see the bigger picture. And it's not easy. You're not going to be able to hit it across the board. Just the nature of everything that you have to accomplish. But as a general rule, I had a boss when I was a lieutenant once tell me, it's something I've tried to live with and not been particularly successful at, but it's like, spend less time on PowerPoint, less slides on making things pretty, because the effect of those is relatively local and it's relatively transitory. Focus your time on engaging with soldiers, providing purpose, providing motivation, because that's going to live on much longer and have a much bigger effect on your organization. It's very challenging to do. Like I said, I haven't been particularly successful if I was to grade myself throughout my career, because the crush of the day-to-day requirements pulls you away from that. But where possible, try to pull yourself out of that and then go do the leadership side of the Army and allow them to be engaged by including them in things, explain the why, explain the big picture, why what we're doing makes a difference, because it'll have a multiplicative effect on the organization.
Okay, in the interest of time and be considerate, we're going to go 2 and then to 4. So for the second row, let's kind of pull that through a little bit more. Is there anything else you guys talked about to help? We talked budgets kind of on the side, but engagement and meaning. Anything that hasn't, saved rounds hasn't been said. Okay, nothing from 2, from the wings. Okay, so I want to go, Major Williams, not put you all the way on the spot, but we talked about other principles and actions, TTPs we've observed or could use, and we talked about AR.
Yeah, so one of the things that we were talking about, because there was a visceral reaction when the AAR part was brought up, and so we started talking about just framing AARs. So when we do a hot wash or an AAR, we say, okay, at a minimum, give me, 2 ups, 2 downs, right? So when you're leaving that AAR, what's the last thing that you talked about? It's negative, right? So instead, like whether you're doing a full-on compliment sandwich where you're talking about the positives and then a negative and then a positive at the end, or at least just reframing it to, okay, we're going to do a hot wash. Give me 1 down, then 1 up. One thing that we need to work on, And then one thing that we think we did really well, you're doing constructive feedback, but you're also leaving with a totally different sense of how that exercise or event went than if you do it the other way, right? So that was one of the things that we talked about. The other was just making sure that we're not, massing on the negative. Even though we want to be constructive, if you're massing on the negative, that's all anyone's going to hear, and no one's going to think about, even if you end with 19 positives, what those positives are. So really tailoring that, the negative or the constructive part to the most precise constructive part possible, and thinking through what is genuinely something that went well versus just, we're motivated. Because that is not helpful or constructive either.
Yeah, they talked about, the way you deliver the one constructive feedback package. So you could have 7 positive feedbacks, and if you're just an absolute jerk, it could all be lost in one message. The way you give that positive feedback, the tone you take matters. Okay, I've overly timed out. I think she's keeping everyone kind of on time today, so if you make closing comments on principles.
I'll just say the hardest thing about this is getting people to actually do it. Because like I said, whether it's 3 gratitudes, whether it's journaling, positive things that are going on, meditation, exercise, all of those things. Exercise is the only one that the Army really just kind of takes out of your hands and allows you to just do. But the truth is, even if someone completely buys into this, the chance of them actually doing the 3 gratitudes or the acts of altruism or that are, what do we think they are? Low or high?
Low.
Incredibly low. So the trick is, how do we figure out how to build these in and not take soldiers, additional soldier time and kind of leave it to them? Because as a general rule, they're not going to do it, and I'm not excusing myself from that either. The way that when I talk to people at staff duty, when I talk to them about this, is like one of the easiest ways to do this, and it'll have a ripple effect, is the first thing you're going to do in the morning for PT is like stretch and warm up. The last thing you're going to do is you're going to cool down. In both of those cases, you can have a conversation. So if you sit there as a team leader or squad leader leading PT, and you say, hey, we're going to go around the circle, and while we're stretching, each person's going to have to say something that's going well in their life, something they're grateful for, or something they saw someone else do that they think is good. And they have to go around the room and do that. And if they don't have something during the warm-up, then they have to think about it during PT, because I'm going to come back during the cool-down. Because what he's found is, in addition to the positives of being in a mental state when you're enjoying yourself, if you remember something, you have a very similar thing. The same part of your brain's going to light up, those same pathways are going to get reinforced, and you're going to get that dopamine hit. So each time that soldier has to say that, he's going to have a very similar mental effect. The other thing is, everybody who's hearing that is going to have a similar effect. That person's brain is going to light up in that portion, and he's going to drop dopamine. He's going to get that dopamine hit. So by going around the room and doing that, you're forcing them into that habit, into that pattern, without expecting them to just have the self-discipline to do it on their own. And it really costs you nothing. But it is a way for you to practice and develop it as a habit. The sneaky benefit to it is, if I know that you're going to do this to me every time that we have PT, what am I going to do between PT sessions? I'm going to start looking for positives, because I don't want to be the guy who says, well, today I got an omelet because there are only 3 guys in the line. I didn't have to get those jacked up eggs that I normally have to get because I'm in a hurry. You don't want to be the person who has that lane positive, so you're going to start looking for it. And it's going to train people to stop focusing exclusively on the negative, to start noticing some of the positive, which is going to just, once again, start putting them in that positive frame of mind and get the part of the brain that we want active more often.
All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. So we're going to talk about the fulcrum and the lever, which is a pretty powerful idea. And really what it comes down to, this idea that if you change your mindset, then you can change your performance. What I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes and write down what's one positive thing you took away from principle number 1 and from war. What is one goal that you are going to focus on learning today? And then how are you going to apply it throughout the course of this week as a leader? So write it down, please. And then what are you going to learn today? What is your goal for today? And then how are you going to apply it as a leader this week? All right, so we'll get into more of that in a bit. So today, some of the really key ideas we'll talk about is the power of time and making the most of the time that you have. So the ones that came in here engaged, you're going to get a lot out of today. The ones that don't have any paper in here, you're probably going to have a problem. All right, so coming in here, caring and making the most of it, that's what differentiates you and what sets your team up for success. The second idea is the power of 10%. All right, so one of the powerful ideas he talks about is that over time, studies show that your circumstances only define 10% of your happiness. So the question is, what does that mean for you and how do you apply that as a leader? And then finally, 55%. So the placebo effect. Why does the placebo effect work 55 to 60% of the time? So it's really fascinating and we'll talk about that. All right, so I'll turn it over to Gus to talk through the slide.
So in the book, he talks about the fulcrum and the lever, and it goes back to the Archimedes principle of if I have a lever long enough, I can move the world. So with that, the fulcrum really is our mindset, how we see things, how we want to frame things. And so with that, like what's reality and what is our perspective? We can do a lot with our perspectives. Like they talk about the camp where they took all the men there. They had them think about nothing that was back from 20 years when they were younger. They couldn't talk about anything past that. They couldn't talk about anything from that. Coming out of there, they noticed a lot of great, big health improvements on these guys. They looked younger, they felt younger, their vision improved. So what really changed? They were still the same age, but it was their perspective, which they was framing the reality. So with that, then it kind of goes into the placebo effect. Like you take something that's supposed to be medicine, you don't know it's not, but your mindset says, hey, this is medicine, and it starts changing the way that your body's reacting to that. And then kind of going into how he's talking about time wasting. If you go into something and you're like, hey, it's just going to be a big waste of time, how you're framing it, it's going to be a waste of time. But a lot of that, it could just be going back to how we're talking to soldiers, hey, I got to deal with this problem, but how can that outcome change the way that soldier is having it their day? It's not a waste of time if you're not getting something done. I'm not fixing that PowerPoint slide, but I'm talking to my lieutenants about their career, how they're doing things, helping them improve their mindset. And then I'll kind of jump over to the job, career, and column. We kind of already touched on it. But the way he talks about the job, you just show up, you're just getting the paycheck, you only care about the money. I mean, that's a lot of ways maybe our E1 and E4 population look at it. It's because of their engagement. They need to the career. Maybe that's some of our lower NCOs. Hey, I want to stay in, I want to make my retirement. I kind of like what I do, but it's not necessarily maybe a calling yet. That calling, it's your profession. It's part of your identity. You love what you do. You show up every day trying to help improve everybody else and help them see the way it is. Just to kind of bring that, I had a boss down at JRTC, and he loved to talk about being an S3. He loved to talk about operations, how he's putting guys in position to fight, win, and survive. And that really had a big impact on me and how I wanted to stay in and be here based on that idea. He saw a lot of captains when I was there just getting out, quitting the Army, because they looked at their S3s and they were like, I hate my job, I hate my life. Maybe a lot of people can relate, but one of his attitudes on that was trying to justify, hey, I enjoy what I do, it's challenging, but bringing people in and making them realize that impact you can have on people is really something that he tried to influence on me, and I really hope it keep it hard. I'll turn it over to Todd here now.
I've got a couple of notes that I don't want to get wrong on the definitions of the breakout discussion here. But really focusing on the job, career, and calling. And I venture to say my argument is the majority in this room, we sit here at the calling level. Some career teetering on calling, but really I'm not too concerned with this group, but look at our formation, all right? And identifying those individuals who view just right now what they're doing as a job, those who view their, their profession as a career, and then not so much as the calling, but how we as a group collectively can identify those and move them to the next tier. So it's going to be very difficult to move from a job to calling, but we can, over time, move that person's mindset, because that is the topic of this chapter, mindset. It's move their mindset from a job to a career, those careers to a calling. So, people who view their work as a calling find that their work and they find their work more rewarding and end up working longer and harder, are generally more likely to get ahead. So the definition of job: to see work as a chore, paycheck as a reward, work because they have to, constantly look at time time that they spend away from their job. Career: work out of necessity, also to advance, succeed, and they are invested in their work and want to do well. And then the calling: work as an end to itself. Work is fulfilling, contributes to the greater good, draws on the personal strengths, and gives meaning and purpose. So how do we change the fulcrum and the lever of those around us? And then how do you influence their mindset? So by battalion, I'd like to go back by battalion and discuss this. So how do we transition, move that mindset from a job to a career, and a career to a calling? The job doesn't matter, just like Aker says. The job, whether it's a rifleman or a platoon sergeant, a company commander, or staff officer. All right, so how do we transition that mindset and find that fulfillment the best that we can? Find their fulfillment, find their why, find their purpose. So we'll take 5-10 minutes, get back into battalions, discuss that question. So again, how do we change the fulcrum lever of those around you, and how do we influence their mindset? So having those two questions in mind, break down a battalion, discuss for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Alright, sir, so as we looked at the whole job career calling aspect, one thing we wanted to look at is just practically at our level as commanders, right? How can we take soldiers from the job to the career and the calling? Something I know that I can improve on a lot is use of our additional duties, okay? So we're not going to walk into a company area, pick a specialist, be like, hey, you're teaching a class for your platoon, because that's not necessarily our place, okay? But something we do have control over are company systems, okay? So maybe if you have a soldier that doesn't feel that involved, if they're still looking at the Army as a job and not so much as a calling, how can we give them vested interest in what's going on at the company level? Well, one way we can do that is we all have additional duty lists a mile long that we have to fill, right? Maybe giving them something and then expecting an output from that, right? If they're in charge of voting, if they're in charge of the boss program, whatever it is they're in charge of, giving them that program and then holding them accountable. That way they're brought into the training meetings, that way they feel like they're contributing to the team. And that's also a great way to get to that 3-to-1 ratio of compliments. Okay, if you have that soldier who you might only see once or twice a week, they're in charge of whatever additional duty, well now maybe you're seeing them 3 or 4 times a day and you're constantly complimenting them on that. So I think that's probably number 1. And then number 2, just how do you move this fulcrum and leverage the fulcrum and the lever to the best of your advantage? How do you make it so that with minimal input on your end, you can maximize the amount of force you can produce in your organization? A great thing for us all is just systems. Like a system, right? One of Rock 6's priorities. So maybe instead of you having to spend 100 hours a week on managing your UAs and your UCFRs and your additional duties and your CSTP and your CMDP, empower your XOs and empower your suppliers, empower your subordinates. That way you have a good system in place, right? Put it in writing. That way you don't have to stress out and make it that much of an emotional event every day. That's what we got.
So I kind of zoned in on the part in the section that talked about a practical exercise you can do to tie your day-to-day tasks to a higher purpose. What it said in the book is just write down your daily duties and then draw a direct line and write what the output of that is. What is the purpose of that? What's the meaning that you get out of that? Now, it's not necessarily going to be a direct exercise we take to our companies and then expect soldiers to write down, like empty out comments, inventory this, draw a line, what they get out of it. But one thing we can do, I got drilled into me pretty early as a cadet, we talked about it here, is whenever you give out a task or expect somebody to do something, try to give a reason why, and the reason why better not be because I said so. So tie in some sort of purpose. I've kind of fallen into it and caught myself before at an AS3 position with some of the lieutenants, where I give them a task, it's like, I need you guys to work on these slides, oh, the reason why brigade asked for it. Well, that's not necessarily the reason why. I can explain what is the purpose of the information we're sharing. Why do we need to share this information? Why is this important? And the same thing can be applied to our soldiers. If we instill this sense of giving a reason why into our junior leaders, into our NCOs, platoon leaders, platoon sergeants, squad leaders, when they expect their soldiers to do something, give them a reason why they're doing it. Why are we laying out this Connex right now? Why are you going to hearing again and again? We kind of see the big picture purpose of a lot of these readiness metrics when we sit in the meetings. We talk about deployability, we talk about readiness, but a lot of times soldiers just hear, oh, go to this appointment again. When we give a reason why, we can shift that mindset of the reason I'm doing this task is because it actually serves a purpose. When we talk about shifting mindset, that's what's moving that fulcrum. Rather than just having them sit down and write it, which you can do, just giving a reason why and getting into the practice of doing that to your subordinates and for them to do to their subordinates starts to frame that mindset of, oh, what I'm doing is actually important. And that's how we transition from I'm just doing a task to there's a purpose to why I'm doing my task. How do you put the column mindset?
And that's why goals are so important. So the goals tie into the line directly. So Mike, so for today, what's your goal for LPD?
My goal for LPD would really be to find ways to train others in the formation in order to establish the purpose and find different ways to do that.
Perfect. So today, over the course of the next couple hours, we will be cued as we talk about specific answers to that question.
For me, sir, it's since we, for Red Knights, we really focus on Principle 5, it's to take away all the Principle 1, 2, 3, 4, the all-encompassing book. I've already written down key things I want to do to take away back to my unit to enable the happiness advantage, I would say. So certain things like the 3-to-1 ratio of complementing soldiers, how we can implement that so we can, I guess, enhance our success rate to make the soldiers feel happier as they're doing their job. Sometimes the job itself for a lower enlisted may just be to go do it because we need them to do it, but we can look outside of the profession to make them feel more valued. And how we can do that, we'll need to be a little bit more creative on the leadership side of the house. So I'm taking away a lot of the discussions, bringing my own notes here, and then working with my XO and First Sergeant and Platoon Sergeant PPLs to figure out what the battery culture can change in a positive way.
Jill Owens.
Yes,
So
sir.
what is your goal for the LPD for the rest of the week? How do you want to apply it to the ROC team?
So honestly, sir, I'll say for me, I was talking about it with the team back here. I know where my own negatives lie in terms of putting too much emphasis in terms of work and the importance of work, right? And I know that always bleeds down to the people that you work around and you work with. So I'm trying to find some ways to implement, starting, to provide that example to my own teammates and those I work around to show that it's not all about work. To try and put things that are more important to us, like family, spending time, whether it's just us joking around, having a good time together, getting out of the office like was mentioned before, and then showing, I think that'll show more of a positive mindset, taking that on further then makes us also perform better at the same time.
I've heard finding a purpose, finding the why, so engage leadership, empowering subordinates. So these are all tools that we can, have our subordinates use during counselings. Identifying that why, finding that work-life balance that the author discusses, finding purpose outside of work, finding those experiences that truly make that soldier happy that they can bring to the formation, bring to work, and be more productive, work longer, harder. Finding that happy balance. Anything else you want to close on before we open it up? Brian?
Kind of the last thing we hit on was talent management. So, anecdotal example. I had a underperforming team leader that had decided his mind was made up, he's getting out in 1 year. Okay, great. I also have an underperforming combo rep who can't do his job. He knows his stuff, but he can't manage anything in there. We decided as a command team we're going to take the team leader out and make him our company combo rep. He's signed for everything and he does it. That soldier re-enlists and reclasses 6 months later. So he said, and he came back later and said, this gave him a renewed purpose, a different perspective, and he found something he genuinely enjoyed doing. So something to carry forward. If you have soldiers, one of the hardest problems with the Army is, I think, retaining talent. And we see it in the officer corps as well as in the junior NCO corps, but we fail to meet our mission in the E5s, E6 population, and lieutenants, captains. So if you challenge those people a little bit more, you find some things that really make them feel fulfilled at work, it'll probably work out.
I have a question. When you reassigned them, do you think you felt more like a valued member of the team?
I would agree, sir. And I think it is that we're talking kind of empowerment and the purpose. I think he gained a larger perspective on kind of what he was doing, felt more like a valued member of the team than he was just a team leader. So it's something that we could have done differently too to address the team leaders, and I think that's kind of where you're headed with that. But yeah, it gave him a couple of
Look around, does anybody have any other input on what they discussed that they'd like to highlight? Yes.
So a little bit of practicality from me and my emotional support first sergeants over here. A lot of our soldiers are not going to, they're not even at a calling level, let alone even a career level. Not all of us are called to, just routinely destroy our bodies like Sergeant Major Denzer has for, 20 plus years or so. But one thing I've used, especially as a platoon leader, whenever we pin a specialist, I would force them to tell me what they're going to become a subject matter expert at on the spot. Because I did have PFCs and specialists that were my go-to crow guy. I mean, I used to be in a deco, the crows are always down, right? So I had a guy that could literally disassemble an entire Humvee, an entire crow, do some shady things with other crow parts, and then get a crow up, right? So whether it's weapons, crows, I feel like I haven't really done that as a commander. Usually we're not the ones pinning specialists on people, but going forward, especially with this new ITN fielding and stuff like that, it's a really good opportunity for a few of our soldiers at least to really own it. Whether they're an RTO or not, they can be that SME on a 163 or a 158 or whatever Wazoo system we find ourselves having. Because we as leaders can't learn that whole thing. And the other thing is those soldiers might get out too. But that's okay. I've had plenty of E5s that were my go-to guys back in a deco, back when I was a platoon leader, whatever. And they're out now and they're better for it. But they were my dude back then. They had the arms room squared away, they had whatever. So I really think that specialist role, I take it very literally, and that's a very tangible thing I feel like people can take away and at least try it, because it was successful for me, at least as a platoon leader.
Kind of on that note, because I've had a boss that, cause I'm assuming the first couple times you did it, you got some kind of wonky answers.
It depended on the soldier, sir.
But then the more you did it, and the more they had an expectation that it was going to happen, as that day was coming, they started kind of thinking about it. And I had a boss that used to ask, like, why do you serve? And just talking about, like, calling. He was like, why do you serve? And initially, like, I hadn't really thought about it, but I knew that as I was getting ready to PCS, that he was going to give me a award, he was going to ask me that question, so I started kind of thinking about it. And it moved me closer and closer to, like, the true answer, and kind of solidified for me kind of the calling. Because initially I was like, oh, I do it for the American people. And then I started thinking about it, I was like, do I? I mean, the average American person, I'm not sure that I like. If I look at the average American person, I'm not real impressed. I think the average American person is kind of hedonistic and lazy, and I'm not serving for them. What I ended up settling on was I serve because I believe in the American dream. Like, I don't think we've realized it, but I believe in what this country stands for. And that's what it is. It's not a person, it's not a group of individuals. It is, I believe in what this country stands for. So just that thing about pinning that and building that expectation that you're going to ask that question to somebody causes them to start thinking more and more about why they do what they're doing and what they want to do next. And just that mental exercise, so they don't sound stupid when you ask them the question, will actually get them closer to something that is important to them, which will cause them to strive harder and try to realize something greater than just getting through the next day and making the next rank.
comment back there for a second.
Good morning, sir. Sam from B66. One of the messages that I believe you should send out back there is to the recruitment. Because from the beginning, I do believe that the recruiters send the soldiers, the future soldiers that they have as a job. With that mentality, that's why when they come in as a job and they were doing the job in the past, which become totally different than what they're doing. Money, freedom, discipline, kind of change their mind, for them not to step into the real profession. So we need to really engage in doing it. We need to send them a message.
I agree 100%. We had a very similar conversation here. I think the Army defaults to the simple. When you talk about pleasure, engagement, and meaning, they're focused largely on like the pleasure side. It's like, hey, here's your college, here's your the paycheck you're going to get, here's all those things. Whereas I think the Marine Corps does a much better job, and the Marine Corps has fewer problems with re-enlistment than the Army does, because right up front, they're not about the money, they're not about any of those things. They are 100% about, do you have what it takes to be a Marine? Are you willing to be an attack dog for democracy? And that's what they focus on in their recruiting, which then translates to the people coming in with a much higher level on the calling side than the job side, which makes their re-enlistment job much simpler. So I agree with you 100%.
Yes, sir. It was kind of like not an excuse. The reason why I say we need their help, because when you listen to AIT and get to all we move pretty fast. And if they start changing their mind, the soldiers' mindset as they come in, to start it as a career where we can build up a little the rest of it and then change it into employment, this will get us into a better place.
So we do 2 points. So the power of belief. So think of the fulcrum itself as the belief. You can't necessarily change your circumstances, but you can change how you react to it. Which is why it's so important to realize that only 10% of someone's happiness is truly defined by the circumstances. That means as leaders, we can help shape 90% of how soldiers perceive reality, how they respond to it, and how they actually grow as leaders, as persons. If you think about the 4-minute mile, right? So no one ever believed it was actually possible to break that threshold. Once one person broke it, and more and more and more. So that's just one example of the power of belief. You see that one person can do something, get people to buy in. There's a lot of evidence to show that your mindset, your belief has a lot more of an impact over your success as an individual, as a team, than the environment itself. And I think for us, that's encouraging, just given the crazy tempo we've been on over the next year, and the certainty that we're going to for the next year.
Yeah, and just to try to tie this back to kind of things that we see and things that we can actually do. Whole thing's basically on the power of perception, and I'm not trying to tell you that if you just change your mindset that circumstances magically change. But Bobo isn't in the book, but if you've seen the video, he kind of has a little talk about his brother-in-law, Bobo. Bobo married Amy the unicorn. But Bobo is a med student, and Bobo calls him up. He's somewhat concerned because he thinks he has leprosy, which is doubly concerning because he just got over menopause. And the truth is, what Bobo has is called the med school effect, because he's going to medical school and he's reading about all of these pathologies, all these mental diseases, all these physical diseases, and the natural effect is they just start thinking that they have these diseases, because the symptoms are relatively vague, and they can scan, they can find certain symptoms that they do have, so they start thinking that they have these diseases. That has become a significantly larger problem in the world today because of the internet, because everybody's got access to Google and everybody's got access to WebMD. So the soldier who has the persistent cough, next thing you know, the soldier thinks he has cancer, because it's always cancer. And then he gets a headache, and now he thinks he's got a tumor. He twists his ankle and he thinks he's got some rare form of bone cancer, because it just starts being this perception thing, and they start catastrophizing everything. And then this is part of my problem with the Army. I started thinking about how we we talk about depression with our soldiers, because it is a problem and it's something that we do need to address. But I believe most of our well-meaning things are actually having the exact opposite effect of what we're trying to do. And I think depression and the conversation with depression is probably the best example I have. Because that conversation normally devolves to, hey man, you all right? No man, are you all right? You can tell me if you're not all right. There are things we can do to help you if you're not all right. And when this conversation happens with me, I'm like, crap, I thought I was all right, but after about the third time, if you asked if I was all right, I started to think maybe I wasn't. So I start scanning my external environment, and I start finding all of these symptoms of depression. Because my finances aren't exactly what I want them to be. None of my relationships are perfect. So I start seeing all of these indicators, and I start actually, by asking the question the way that we ask it, we've actually created the exact thing that we're trying to help soldiers with. So that's just one of those things where I think we just need to pivot it. If we're trying to help soldiers with depression, rather than just harassing them by asking them if they're all right, we can start doing some of these other things that we know cause people to be happier. Rather than asking them and then trying to find them resources for depression, sometimes providing them, engaging them in their work, and providing them meaning to their job is going to have the effect that we're looking for. So nothing about their actual situation changed, but by doing the asking them if they're depressed, asking them if they're depressed, asking them if they're depressed, we've actually activated a portion of their brain that is going to be least helpful in helping them solve their problems. Because everybody's got some financial strain, everybody's got some relationship problems, but if I'm hanging out in the eniac just fell off the bed side of my brain, I'm going to be less likely to be able to identify strategies and come up with them and work myself out of that problem. And I'm going to end up in this downward spiral where I'm looking for indicators, I'm looking for symptoms, and I'm in the part of my brain that is less able to deal with them than if I start doing more positive things with that soldier, engaging their prefrontal cortex, and allowing them to develop strategies so that they can get out of their financial problem, get out of their relationship problem. So nothing's changed other than the way that they're looking at it. I talk to the staff duty in the morning about this all the time, and I talk to them about the soldier who's getting ready to get out of the Army. And normally that's when we start having conversations with them about their finances and if they're prepared and what their goals are and everything else. And the soldier realizes that he's not ready. He's only got like $400 in his bank account, and he's getting ready to step out into the outside world. And he's really got two choices. He either steps out and now he's in crisis and probably gets a 60-hour-a-week job. He planned on going to college with a 60-hour-a-week job. He's not going to college, and he's stuck. He's trapped in this job that he doesn't really have a way to get out of. Conversely, if we start having this conversation so he either does that or he extends. Conversely, if we had this conversation 2 years prior to him getting out, we start talking about him wanting to go to college, and we start helping him look at his budget and figure out how much he's saving versus how much it's going to cost to be in college, figuring out how to whittle down the cost of college, figuring out how to increase the amount of savings he has so he gets to the point where he can just step out. He may also come to the conclusion that he doesn't have enough time to save enough money, and then he extends so that he has 12 more months to build that base. So in both cases, the soldier has decided that he's going to extend. In one case, he extended because he was stuck. In one case, he extended because it was going to allow him to achieve his dream of going to college. Completely different mental place that he's at in those two conversations. So exact same decision, but because now he's extending to achieve a goal as opposed to extending because he's stuck. It's just a completely different soldier, and you're going to see completely different things out of him. And it ties to this job, career, calling as well. You're not going to find every soldier who wants to be a career soldier. The truth is the Army won't survive if everybody stays in forever. Like, we need attrition. We need certain people to go out just because of the natural pyramid of our rank structure. But it doesn't mean that if you don't talk to them about, like, hey, your job is, the only reason why you're doing this job is because you do want to go to college and then you want to go on and do something, own a business, do whatever. this is a building block and it's a step, and we tie this job and his performance in this job to gaining experience, building the financial resources he needs to go to college or to buy that business or do whatever else. He sees this as all just part of a larger plan for him for how he's going to achieve his dream. So he doesn't need to be looking at it as a career, he doesn't need to be looking at it as a calling, he just needs to see this as part of his larger plan to get to what they want, as opposed to, I'm just treading water here. And you'll see a more engaged soldier who's actively looking for experiences, and he doesn't want to get busted, he doesn't want to have you take money Article 15-wise, all these different things. So you don't have to necessarily get to the nirvana of it being a calling, but you can still, if you tie it to what his long-term plan is, or her long-term plan, you end up getting yourself a soldier who's more engaged and is a more productive soldier. One of the other things that they talked about here that I didn't want to just completely gloss over was stereotypes and how they can be self-defeating. Do we have those inside of our organization? And one of the simplest ones for them is, what battalion do we have the lowest expectation for air assault? The BSB? Is there any reason for that? Are they different soldiers when they come in? What battalions frequently crush people on organized sports day? The CSS ones. So it's not that they're physically not capable. So why, like, do we think the fact that we just go in with the assumption that 626 is going to have the lowest number of air assault is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy and exacerbating our problem? So just look at your organization and think about the different groups and which ones you have lower expectations for, and do a hard assessment of whether or not your lower expectation is actually creating the lower performance.
Okay, hey, I told everybody they're going to get a bathroom break on Mountain Line, but the first two principles went about 40 minutes each, a little bit long. That's okay because the discussion matters. So, stand up, stretch your legs, reset your brain, go to the bathroom if you need to. Get back in here and we'll start the next one at 8:14.
How's everybody doing? Good. Awesome. All right, so we're going to talk about the Tetris effect, and here's the thing. I'm not talking about crap. So we're going to ask a couple of questions here. I got my panel of White Curry commanders and first sergeants here that are ready to answer a whole lot of questions. And everybody else here, I'm asking you to join in and support this operation here. So first and foremost, somebody give me like the, what's the elevator version of what's the Tetris effect? Anybody from the back there? Brian.
Yeah, so after your brain gets accustomed to seeing, so it comes from playing Tetris, right? So after you are accustomed to taking shapes and sizes and organizing into certain patterns, after you leave the game, then everywhere else in life you begin to recognize similar patterns. So like for us in the military, we were accustomed to analyzing risk and like looking for negatives essentially, whether that's through ARs or whatever the case may be. So then throughout the other portions of our life, then we start to recognize negative patterns, risks, etc., and then that affects our personal life and other areas of our professional life.
Start to see everything as a negative. Okay, so I have to ask a generational question here. Raise your hand if you've actually played Tetris. I'm impressed, all right? It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. The better question would have been, who has not played Tetris? Anybody? I think everybody raised their hand. I'm impressed. All right, so I think Brian had a very good point there as to how you start to see patterns, and those patterns define how you look at the next thing in there. What else do we call that? Stereotypes, right? Stereotypes are often important for us to categorize something, but a stereotype can also lead you in the wrong direction because it makes you think a certain way about a topic, a subject, an individual that may not be true because we haven't properly evaluated it, right? So this is, you all know this person. Who here knows someone in this room or someone you work with who's that annoyingly, overwhelmingly positive individual? Raise your hand if you're that person or you know that person.
Sometimes. Other times.
Carla Harrison up here self-selected. All right. So that's one. Who knows that person who's the overwhelmingly Eeyore type person? Who is that guy?
Every XO.
Right there, right? All right. So here's what I would ask you. As leaders, what does that do to those people around you? How does that affect how your organization runs on a day-to-day basis? Any thoughts? Does it help? Does it benefit? Yes.
It certainly bleeds into the organization. Like the overly positive can rub people the wrong. Like it doesn't always make a positive outlook. It can rub people the wrong way. It can show like that you don't have a sense of realism, or like the Eeyore will just bring everyone down around you. You'll be sad, and sun will turn into rain. The usual.
That's right. What's the? Who watched We Were Soldiers? Everybody's seen it, right? Who walks by? Says, "Good morning, Sergeant Major." You know what kind of goddamn day it is, right? It's the constant, the beat down. Does that affect the Tetris effect? Does that affect what we're talking about here? Do those little things add up? Yeah.
Sir, I will say the overly, negative person also typically does look out for a lot of things that I think they're overprotective, they overanalyze things. That also is a benefit to having that person. And then the ultra positive person sometimes, like you just said, overlooks some of the things that the Eeyore person would see here. I think they would see.
Right. But let me ask you this. I want you to take yourself and put yourself back in the world of World War II, 101st Airborne Division. Bastogne, 1944. Who do I want in command there? The overly negative or the overly positive? And I don't know, overly positive, we're talking extremes. Negative or positive? How do we answer when the Germans demand our surrender? If you're the overly negative individual that can't see his way out of it, that's only looking at the risk, that's only looking at the challenges. Or how do you answer it when you look around at the organization and you go, well, we trained for this. This is what we're supposed to do. Behind enemy lines, outnumbered, cut off, alone. Oh well, it's just another day. Right? It's another day at the office.
So an important distinction, like when we talk about like positivity, we're not looking for detachment from reality, which is kind of what you guys are talking about. Ideally, what you're looking for is someone who's in generally positive mood and has an optimistic view of the future. Like there's that subtle difference there. Like no one wants the guy who's like, you're doing an attack and you just lost 75% of your people. Doing great, guys. Let's keep going. I mean, like, it's not going great, and we need to sit down and we need to AAR this. We made some pretty significant like blunders or whatever. But it's just the guy who is just constantly in a negative mood and is always just sharpshooting and seeing all the negative. There is a value. Like I don't want people walking by things that are wrong and not modifying things and not pointing things out that aren't right. But at the same time, it's the guy who, regardless of the situation, and they're out there. I mean, and I've been that guy at times where I'll just sit there and through an entire brief just point out everything that's negative and ignore the fact that 75% of the brief was good. So that's like the thing here. Is like don't ever read into this whole happiness advantage and positivity thing that is meant to be detached from reality. It's just like don't let just the negative consume you. That there are positive things going on in the organization and in the whatever it is that you're doing. Not everything is negative, because that does like start sucking the morale of everybody. And the guy who's completely unrealistic with positivity is obnoxious as shit. Like no one wants to be around that guy, and I fully acknowledge that.
Sir, there's a point of this chapter that talks about people who are in negative feedback loops where all they see is the negative. What that hinders them from seeing positive opportunities. So if the commander of 101st Airborne at Bastogne was in that negative Tetris effect, to be like, oh no, Germans are going to surround us.
my division will lose, will be cut off, we won't be able to get resupplied very well. And what that would have eliminated was the opportunity for greatness, which is what the 101st Airborne achieved at Bastogne. Obviously, the 101st at the time held terrain, and that proved to be one of their best historical narratives, right? Like the 101st defeated an enemy armored advance where they were incredibly outnumbered, and we now have that reputation for being like one of the toughest divisions in the so you lose opportunity if you're constantly in that negative Tetris feedback.
Right. Okay, so I think to bring it back down to us individually, and this gets more to the point of everybody read the chapter, everybody learned a few things. We got the idea of what the Tetris effect is. So how do you apply it? So looking at some major points, things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. First and foremost, how do you, as an individual, as a commander of First Arms, how do you apply this or how do you influence this in your organization every single day? Somebody throw out some ideas.
Sometimes they're a cheat.
Perfect.
So when I used to play Tetris, there was the pause button when my mom was yelling at me, or when I wasn't sure what my next move was. And I think it's okay to hit pause and like hold the audience and have a dialogue about, okay, what does this mean, and where are we going, and how can we best shape this? Instead of just pretending like you have to have the answer in the moment. Right now, I have this emotional reaction towards this. Like, let's hit pause, let's talk about it before we execute. Some things have repercussions across the team.
Sure. What else? How else do you apply this every day?
So I think there's value in what Ward 3 just said about the power of reevaluation, reassessment. So we had a difficult time qualifying my sections and my batteries specifically. So we had to reevaluate the training curriculum that we had initially outlined so we can get all the sections and soldiers to get to where we need to be. So I think there is power in reassessing. Sure, we're defeated at this time, and then we go.
So when you have to reassess, how do you approach that as a commander? What are your two options? Somebody else. You have to reassess. You got to stop and do a little bit of retraining. How do you approach that? Fine, Joe.
Sir, I would have to just pull at least all of my COs together, kind of see what's the best advice to approach them.
Okay.
They would be the ones handling at least the soldier environment. Not very different from the military perspective, but I mean, is this guy who might get hit, might need to have some young engineers better than he's there.
Well, so we're not talking individual, we're talking about organization, right? As an organization, your organization has to stop and reassess or retrain. How do you as a commander approach this? In the back.
So when I was a long time ago, a platoon leader, not as long as some of the people in the front room, but we did a platoon live fire, and the dry run was good. The blank run was atrocious. And I was pissed because I was short-tempered. My battalion commander pulled me aside, and like, Chris, how you address your platoon in the next minute will set the tone for the rest of the day, right? So take a minute, don't go back and just fuck them up. Go back and find those positive things that you guys can pull forward that you did well, which really taking that approach kind of set the tone for the rest of the day when we executed the live fire going forward and into the night iterations was just by focusing on some of the positive things, those bad things that we did wrong kind of worked themselves out over the next iteration. So kind of looking through it with a different lens than just focusing on those things.
And I think Mike's example is pretty good, because like I said, I don't want you to ignore the negative and pretend it's not there. Like, he knew he had a problem. They were not qualified. That is not good. Like, putting a positive spin on it is not going to help. But it's realizing that everything is not negative, that he has a local problem. He has good soldiers. He has good equipment, might be a stretch, but he's got time, he's got resources, he's got smart leaders around him. So yes, he has a problem, and yes, it's objectively bad. It's not good. It is going poorly. has a support system. He knows that he has a good team around him. He knows that he has time. He knows that he's got people outside of his organization that he can reach out to. So it's not ignoring that things aren't going well. It's recognizing that it's a local, temporary thing and not a broad, all-encompassing, permanent thing. So he's like, okay, I have a problem. I have a team. I'm going to bring the team together. I'm going to develop a strategy, and I'm going to move forward. And if he's in that constant negative frame, and that's where he lives, he's not using the part of the brain that's going to allow him to identify the problem, develop the strategy, and ultimately fix the problem. But because he realizes that it's all is not bad, this is bad, now he can tap into that portion of his brain, he can tap into his support structure, he can reach higher, he can reach laterally, and he can find out what Taj has done well. He can reach out to Mike and figure out what he's doing. He just start reaching out to Hanson and everybody else and figuring out how can I solve this problem. Bring his team of experts in, come up with a plan, distribute that plan, and then execute the plan. And then that temporary failure turns into success. And now not only have they qualified, now they all have a better system for how they're going to do it next time. All those junior subordinates have seen what failure looks like. They've tasted it. They've had someone talk them through what they were doing wrong. They have changed what they're doing, and they've seen the positive results. So that's how you take like a local failure and a local negative. You remain positive because it's the optimism for the future, and then you develop that strategy, you implement it, and now you have a success.
Kind of along those lines, so one thing that I've noticed and kind of become hyper-focused on, mostly from playing like bingo during briefings where you keep track of like one little thing, is the way that most of us in the Army talk is like we'll start our sentences with, well, the problem with that is, I think Sir's done it like 10 times just in the past like 10 minutes here. Just like not even thinking about it, but like consciously not starting a sentence with like the problem with that, especially when like your subordinates are bringing you like an issue or like a plan, right? Like, hey, sir, here's the range I want to run. Well, the problem with the plan is this, this, and this. But it takes like active, like conscious, like effort to not do that. So I'd challenge you guys, like keep track of how many times you're saying that a day, or how many times you notice other people saying that. I pointed out to Major Blanchard all the time, like, you know how many times you just told that person like the problem with what they're doing, like. And I think he's getting better at it, right? But it's like it takes effort and conscious effort. So.
I like the example with Red Knights with qualifying, and you know we've all ran into our own issues, whether it's in training, whether it's through like an actual like lane, a 6-lane. And so I think the way we as commanders and senior leaders and senior officers address these problems is how you would address it, like when we do what we're trying to do, like you're in contact with firefighters. Right, so if you encounter an issue, what's the first thing you're going to do? And you got to take that tactical pause, like Sir said, hey, I hit pause on Tetris, right? First thing you're going to do in your mind is not think about the negative. You wouldn't hit a pause if you wouldn't have had a negative, right? You would have kept going. You hit a pause, the negative already paused you. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to, see where your forces are arrayed, right? You're going to find that positive and expound on the positive. Okay, if I'm getting held up in, let's say, a 10 series, a building, and I need to go into it, what I'm probably not going to do is be like, okay, why the hell can't we get into it? It doesn't matter what I'm getting into it, right? Part of that, you've already digested why we can qualify, hey, we can get in here. Hey, I got a good support by fire here, or this squad's here. How about I leverage that positive, something I have good, to make that negative become a positive, right? So if we kind of think of that already, instead of just digging into the negative and start having this big dialogue about what's going on with the qualifications we really needed. Hey, we did good here. We did good on this table. Who was the SME on this table? How about we go ahead and see if that SME can help us on this table, or maybe we train some trainers right now, or at the end of the day, that when we go out tomorrow, we can do it. So expounding on a positive will inevitably bleed into fixing the negative.
All right. So, all very good points. There was something I was trying to get at here with this one, and I failed miserably guiding this conversation, but I'm going to try and redirect a little bit. Daily, day to day, not a major training event, not we failed at something, day to day. The Tetris effect is not built on we had a big training event and we did something positive. It's built on
every single thing, conversation that we do, how we approach everything, how we handle each day, and how we address problems throughout our day-to-day that builds a positive mindset that changes the way we look at the world, right? What are the little things that you, as a commander, as a first sergeant, do within your organization day-to-day that are minor twists, minor changes in how you approach each day?
So in this boat shop, we do a little section sync every day where we're talking about admin, we're talking about other problems we need solved. And every single day, Chief Drake comes out, first of all, is a student before and is involved in that sync, right? He could be doing 1,000 other things, but he's not. He's in there. And every single day, he stops to say, I want to make sure everyone in this room knows how much I appreciate working with you and how much I enjoy being a part of this team. And it doesn't matter if it, like, everything else has gone wrong that day, he takes the time to say that and look every single person in the face. And that's something that I've really learned from, is that pausing and vocally appreciating everybody, because it makes us work just a little bit harder as a team when we have that moment.
What else?
So I think there's a lot of value in like being specific about problems. We talked about like catastrophizing, but if you're just like always looking for a specific shape, and you're not being like, okay, I'm looking for this specific shape, not just trying to fit in whatever I've got kind of forcing into this block. And like we see it a lot in like Lean Six type of like problem solving, where it's like if you don't have like if you're not specific about the problem, like you can't just say like the problem is the result that we're not getting. Like the problem is a part of the chain. And I think there's an inherent optimism in driving your teams towards like let's productively look at like what's wrong in our chain and not just spend our 30 minutes or an hour in our meeting admiring the problem. And I think as leaders, like when we enforce that, we like actually drive towards like optimistically pursuing a resolution instead of just dwelling in admiring the problem.
So I'm going to get straight to the point because there's one thing I've looked at, right? Who here has ever been told that they have resting bitch face? I mean, I think in the Army we read it, right? We do. Like everybody, who remembers the old command photos? You have to scowl at the camera, right? Who has a command photo that they're scowling at the camera? Raise your hand if that's an ask you do. All right, so here's a question for you. You guys watch baseball? Who watches baseball? You know what their walk-up music is? Right? What's your walk-up music? How does your company or your battalion or whatever see you when you walk into the building? Do they look at you and go, that's the boss? That's someone I trust in? That's someone I can rely on? Or do they walk in and go, get me the hell out of here? How are you building positivity, trust, belief, whatever in your organization? From the smallest actions. Do people walk up to you and say, hey, good morning? Or do they walk around and avoid you? Do you walk by and talk to people? Ask them how their day is. Talk to them like the boss was talking about what their future looks like, what opportunities they have, what options they have, how the Army can help them. Or do you ignore the conversation? Or do they ignore you? Those are the different conversations you gotta have with yourself. That's what I'm talking about day to day. How do you build the Tetris effect day to day, all right? So those are different things that you can think about. There was a comment over here, a question.
When I was in Exos, I worked for a couple of different commanders. One was like a generally negative company commander, who was kind of like always focusing on a lot of negative things. The second one was generally happy and positive guy, and he did very similar to what you described. It's like when you walk in the building, you see any junior soldiers, he's like, hey, how was the weekend? How's it going? And that like instantly changed the culture of the company just by doing simple things like asking, how was your weekend? How was your day? What are you doing this week? Those types of things. Those small little social interactions with the junior soldiers really paid dividends.
Yeah. Thank you. So then, if you can look at the things, and I'm going to cut to the chase here. If you can look at the things on how you change what's in your day to day, then as commanders first sergeants, how do you design training to also get up to the same thing? All right. So let's take a very simple infantry training event.
Squad sticks, right? Everybody's here is running squad sticks, right? How do you build positivity and, you know, a foresight into an individual or into an organization through that training event? Anybody?
Maybe you crawl, walk, run, sir.
Crawl, walk, run.
Give them something that they can easily accomplish. Start off on a positive note, and then progress in a harder, more dynamic.
So let me ask you this. Do you ever get to the point where they cannot accomplish the mission? Yes or no?
Yes.
I think there's absolute value in getting punched in the face. But is there value in getting punched in the face the first time out of the gate? Probably negative value, right? So that's another point here, is that if you're looking at this effect, what you're trying to accomplish with the effect. You designed the training. You are supposed to resource, supervise, oversee, assess the training. That's our goal here. And we are trying to bring people from this lower level to a more trained and ready level. How do we progress them through that, knock them back down, and build them up again? How do they handle the point where they get knocked down? How do we handle JRTC? How much did it suck this last year for those of you that were there? I will be honest, I remember a conversation at 3 o'clock in the morning with Rock 6 where I was like, I just want to crawl in a hole and die. Like, I'm ready to be done. I've been punched in the face enough times. It's time to be done. But the resiliency was already built there from all the other training that we did. That's your job. That is your job, is to build that positivity, that resiliency through the challenging, realistic training that gets you to the point that you can handle the overwhelming difficulties or adversity and be able to come through it. And that's the one, that little quote up here that the 3 found for me. That's from the British Commandos. One of their ethos is cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Positivity in the face of adversity. The belief that we're going to succeed. It may not look pretty right now, but we're going to succeed. So, last thing, as we're looking at this, we talked about how do we do it within our organizations, individual organizations, how do we approach it with our mindset, how do you do it in training, how do we change something within the brigade on the larger scale. Things that can be changed on a day-to-day basis, things that can be changed on a regularly occurring basis that can address a positive mindset versus a negative. Any thoughts?
Technique I've seen is when you do your safety groups at the end of the week, it's very easy to take that to a negative place. But you use that as your last opportunity to say, hey, here's what we succeeded at this week. Here's something that we've done to move forward. Versus, hey, the last thing to say is don't be, X, Y, Z, don't be stupid. Instead of taking an opportunity to say, hey, this is something that we've done well. This is how we build trust with the organization. Don't squander it. That's a better way to look at it. Is classic mitigation. How do we people think, hey, I trust you, you've done well, and how do we move forward versus here's a chance to, do what was bad because I've seen it.
On that, we've empowered our boss rep, one of those junior soldiers, giving him that buy-in, and we've started having him, hey, these are the things that are going on in Clarksville, these are the things that are going on in Nashville this weekend, these are the events, the beer festivals, the cat week convention, the whatever it is. Get out of your barracks room and go do something positive. Have a good weekend, so it's not just don't beat your spouse, don't get a DUI.
I think, sir, throughout the first 3 principles so far, really across the book, is that the underlying theme is like sincere intentionality, right? It's like, do we view the people that we're working with as as a means to an end, or do we do them as part of the end that are worth investing into? Iron 6 from his vacation from Fort Polk reached out, and we were talking about some of these things, but one thing we implemented last week, we talked about some easy ones you could do, or like some bad rhythm injects, right? Communicating those, where it ultimately holds yourself accountable for what you're trying to achieve. So last week we tried this, second iron, and I thought it was a pretty good idea, but recognizing soldiers of the week, especially the higher up we go, seems like we're only more exposed to negative issues, right? And I feel for the medical professions and the lawyers, right? Because they're always just dealing with that. Like, hey, there's really good soldiers out there, just really got to find them. So we had an idea in a training meeting last week where we recognized a soldier, and like unbeknownst to me, right, the soldier helped pull out a parent and a child out of a car that was just an accident, but unknown to us, right? But I was able to recognize him and his efforts, right, and was able to normalize that behavior. So I think it's like how to be intentional about normalizing behavior, especially when we only hear the just really pretty much negative things from service up for our organization.
Any other thoughts, comments? How else do you want to see this implemented in the brigade? What would you like Rock 6 to do every week? He said Sure, any comments?
Yeah, so this is the one that I kind of struggle with the most, because the truth of the matter is, the Army has spent a lot of time on building the Texas effect in all of you. It's come from your experience, it comes from stories you've heard, things that you've seen, and I don't want to dampen it, because what's happened really with it is things have become automatic and it allows you to see things very rapidly. You can see what's going to go wrong with this particular soldier in his off time. I don't want to dampen that, because there's value added to that. You can see what's going to go wrong in this patrol. I want you to point that out. Brigade's got some crazy plan for how to fix whatever. The first sergeant in the room can be like, I've seen this tried before, and this is where it's going to fail. Boom, boom, boom. All of that is constructive and helpful for the unit. I think what the real thing to this is how do we either one, kind of pivot the conversation slightly so that as opposed to it putting people in a negative place, it puts them in a more positive place. And we talked about the safety briefing. Like you sitting there saying, don't go out and get a DUI. Slight pivot, but you can now accentuate a positive as opposed to a negative. Hey, listen, if you're out there and you're drinking and your plan falls apart, call me. Call this person. Call this. And show the system that's in place. So it's not about the tale of woe. You're going to go out and you're going to DUI, then you're going to go MAR, it's going to end your career. It's like, hey man, if you get yourself in a situation where you're drinking and your plan is falling apart, give us a call. Let us take care of you. That's what being part of a family is. The finance. Whenever you talk to soldiers about finance, the most common conversation that happens is the guy, you tell the soldier the story, the guy who bought the Charger, $70,000 car, 23% APR, financial ruin, leads to relationship problems, leads to bad duty performance, and we've just described to him the exact situation that we don't want him in, but we put him in a negative place. Instead, start talking to him about TSP and how saving money and what he can do with this, to not have a DUI and to have a soldier who's financially independent. And you're just pivoting it slightly where it's not about the tale of woe, it's about how the unit can take care of you. It's about how that you can realize your dreams. So it's just that slight pivot. So don't turn off the ability that you guys have all earned through your careers of identifying problems before they're problems. Just kind of figure it out. We talked about the sticks lane or the JRTC rotation. There's nothing more obnoxious than when you know the person evaluating you has already written the AAR before he's walked out there. Because you know that now he's just cued in on spotting all of those things and that he's going to find them because he's looking for them or she's looking for them. If you're doing squad sticks and you already know what things your squad are going to screw up, don't wait for the AAR. Let's have that conversation back during LTT. Let's have that conversation during sticks as opposed to the ex-eval. So it's just getting ahead of that. So don't turn off the Tetris. Now, the other thing that I'm going to tell you to do is to balance it. That's the key to this whole thing. And it's not about, once again, you not identifying problems and you not trying to get ahead of them. It's you being optimistic about the future. It's about that, hey, listen, we screwed this up. This did not go well objectively during this sixth lane or during your weekend performance. But I am optimistic about the future, about how we're going to recover from this, how we're going to learn from this, how we're going to put a new system in place to keep us from getting here again. So it's the balancing of the Tetris effect, because we all have been trained to spot the negative. That's a good thing. But we walk by thousands of positive things every day. Soldier shows up late. No one else in the platoon showed up late. We completely ignore the fact that some of the people showed up early and squared all these different things away that were going to set up the rest of the day for success. Because all we do is focus on that one negative thing. I'm not saying ignore the fact that the guy was late. You need to correct it. That's part of your job. However, we also need to see the positive things that happen. Because if there's one truth that I have found in the Army, in life in general, the things that you reward are the things that you are going to encourage. And if all we do is focus on the guy who's late, and we don't focus on the guy who showed up early and squared away something that's going to lead to success the rest of the day, we're not going to keep having that guy come in because no one pays any attention to it, because no one rewarded it. So we have to just balance the Tetris effect and also be looking for those continual good things that happen in a unit. Start seeing those as well, start rewarding those things, and what you're going to find is that more and more soldiers are going to start to do it because they want to be rewarded too, and have been shown that this is the type of behavior that's valued. We spend an inordinate amount of time showing people behavior that we don't think is acceptable. We need to start focusing also on showing the behaviors that we do want to happen. Make sense?
I kind of want to preface this with, I think this chapter kind of internalizes like how external influences are like rest inside you. So some of the other things are like theories and like how to solve problems that are outside, and this is inside. And then first and foremost, I won't say any names, but we, some people that when we were talking about this in the battalion, the cynicism was just funny because we went to falling down immediately, like boom, and then went to the movie falling down immediately. Not looking at falling up. We just were like, hey, how do we like connect this with like the negative reinforcement first? And I think that's kind of interesting because I think a lot of us in here, especially the NCOs, are groomed to look at some of the dark humor and the cynicism in everything that we do. It's almost like when something fails, we find the humor in it before we find out the consequences of it. And I think that's like a coping mechanism for us to get through some of the things that are outlined in this chapter. We're going to cover mental mapping, post-traumatic growth, which is interesting. That was covered. Learned helplessness. That's very interesting, especially if you're a SEER graduate or if you're just like a soldier back in the early 2000s, like me and some of my fellow sergeant majors were. Definitely experienced learned helplessness. And then changing the explanatory style. I think that's also very interesting that we'll cover. And then lastly, I'll follow up with the ABCD model and then just kind of how that relates and how we can put this into practical exercises. So, I really want to focus on just the lead-in really quickly on the chapter, because to me the most important thing is, like, I ask myself, why do I find the negative and then laugh at the negative so much inside of my own mind when I see something that's bad first? Like, why do I go to that first? And I think I've seen through my experiences, I've seen things that are traumatic and that I've lost a lot of friends because of it. And some of my coping mechanisms, I feel, is to find humor in something that's a tragic thing first. And I don't know if that's good or bad or indifferent. I don't talk to mental health professionals because I think it works for me. It works, and it's gotten me through some of the hardest times that I've experienced. But I do think that some of the methods that are in here are really useful when we're talking about soldiers that don't have that learned experience and didn't get that. And I think the Army, by design, has taught me that without actually explaining it to me. I think this is just a way that we can get to the same point. And like I said, I'll follow up with the ABCD model and how I think, from an NCO perspective, how we can apply it. So, without further ado, I'll pass it over to.
Good morning, Major Murphy, Iron 5. I'll be talking about mapping the ways to success. Now, what Sean Acker describes as mental mapping is that we all have as human species, develop a way to get to point A to point B in achieving our goals. He likens it to, in our primal days, we had a certain way that we wanted to get to food. And in the business world, we kind of map out the path to success as far as a business deal. In our case, we kind of map out the success for planning an operation or accomplishing an operation, or on my side, kind of get after those overdue 60-day services that we so desperately need to get done. But we all have a way of doing things to try to, accomplish our goals. Now, there's 3 distinct paths, and Sean points out that we mostly fall in the first 2. 1, event happens, and we think, well, prior to the event, that nothing's going to change. It's going to remain the status quo, and we're not going to get any better. The next path is that event happens, and then afterwards, it's drastically worse, and we're going to be much worse off than where we were prior to that. Then he goes into the 3rd path, which is his path to falling up. A bad, tragic event happens, but we figure out the way to learn from that and to be better. He then transitions into talking about how post-traumatic stress disorder kind of, leaves people in a very negative sense, leaves people into a very negative way. But with very traumatic events, there's also a possibility for great growth. And so instead of PTSD, he asserts that from PTSD you can get to PTG, post-traumatic growth. In the study that he had, that he referenced, that studied the victims of the 2004 September 11th bombings in Madrid, if you all remember, those people that underwent the study that had more of a positive mindset, that saw the good in what had happened to them, were fundamentally happier in their lives. So kind of moving back to what we talked about in the Tetris effect, we have events that happen to us in the Army, such as the JRTC event. JRTC is a significant emotional event for most people. So either people can come out of that training event either unchanged or thinking that it was a waste of time and that they didn't learn anything, or they can take it as an opportunity to grow from that and make themselves better, make their organizations better. So one thing I'd like to posit to you all is, are we making the most of, making allowances for people to fail? Are we fostering an environment for people to grow from their failures instead of focusing on their failures? I know for me, I need to probably, I've noticed that I get too wrapped up in, making sure the task is accomplished, that maybe I don't think about how other people are learning from those failures because I'm so focused on trying to get the damn thing done. But I'll pass it over to Major Clark, who's going to go over the 3rd path.
All right. So what the exercise is displaying, I don't think will be too revelatory for a lot of this audience about how we handle adversity. But it's very worth noting, right, as we go, that how does the 3rd path get hidden, right? The path of resiliency that we often talk of, we want our soldiers to be resilient, we want this to happen, right? But basically he talks about, he uses anecdotal evidence as he does throughout most of the book. But he talks about learned helplessness, and I could not help but think there's a couple of lessons here that directly apply from these readings with learned helplessness and economic whiplash that directly apply to our situation, right? So he talks about 2008, we talked about all these Fortune 500 companies who are currently in the midst of the recession, laying off employees left and right, stocks are plummeting, and how difficult it is. I offered to him that a assisting session post JRTC would be a lot more difficult. But he basically talks about how difficult it is to talk to these 2008 CEOs, whatever or not, right? They're also paralyzed and isolated, right? Often alluding to like principle 7, like why the socialization is so important. But basically, it goes down this learned helplessness, and it basically starts, he uses this example of the dogs in the box, right? And talks about what runs us. It's the dogs. They won't do anything if something's wrong with them. They don't respond to the shock. I couldn't help immediately draw that comparison, like that's how we often think. I am absolutely guilty of this, saying that this 18 to 22 generation is, it's the soldiers. It's not my inability to be creative or inability to come to new solutions to train these soldiers where we need to get them. But instead, I basically just say, it's the dogs. They won't do anything. Something's wrong with them. Give me the old ones back, right? And then we transition over to economic whiplash. So what does that create, right? That's a retrospect from principle 3, where you're just basically spiraling out of control, where these negatives are reinforced. You basically have the idea of like, yes, it is this because it's what I'm looking for, and that self-fulfilling prophecy becomes that more evident. So ultimately what happens is it becomes a belief of futility, our own action, right? We were saying we can't control this because of the circumstances, right? We were talking about earlier, 10% that we can. 10% of circumstances only dictate that. This is 9% that we all dictate. So in general, that's exactly why third patch gets hidden, right? It's something that's just reinforced continuously amongst our soldiers, and it's something that we easily could overcome, right?
All right. So before we open it up to questions, I just kind of wanted to put this into, how we can implement it. And I think after going over this ABCD, some of the things that I figured out is kind of like we've known about this for a long time. There's different expressions that we've said throughout our time. Think about the good stuff that's incorporated inside of MRT, or just people telling you to be more positive, which I hate those people. But your high school coach, like after a loss, your high school coach was able to get everybody together to focus on the good things. I'm not sure about the Dallas Cowboys kicker. I don't know if that would count. But like the motivational pictures inside of the office building, right, with like Mount Everest on it and stuff. I think what I'm trying to get at is everybody knows that adversity happens to them, and everybody knows that there's this positive outcome that you're supposed to do. In our profession, the profession of arms, I think we do that best with counseling, individual, counseling sessions that we have with one another. We take our learned experiences and then we try to pass them down through counseling. So I think if something happens to a soldier, the first thing that we do is we punch them, right? We hit them with an event-oriented counseling, and usually when our junior leaders have an event-oriented counseling, it's like writing them up at work. I don't think that it's through the lens of a sergeant major now how many event-oriented counselings I see. There's nothing substantial for that soldier to learn from when they have those conversations. It's more an administrative tool to get that soldier out of the Army. It's a log on the record that we can use to send it up to brigade to get them transitioned. And I think we have to take a step back and we have to look at how we can put the ABCD model on side of our counseling statements, or if you do it MFR, maybe you can use that as a guideline to outline, well, an adversity happened. And more importantly, like a small piece, because this whole book's premises is like count the pennies and the dollars will add up. Don't just try to tackle something huge. Like find something that was like small that soldier did, that was negative. Write it in event-oriented counseling, and then try to figure out where that soldier's belief systems are. And then once you understand that, have that soldier start talking about the consequences of those actions, like he's his own advocate or she's her own advocate. And then on the back, there's this cool little thing that we never do, but we don't really write a plan of action for any of those soldiers, to dispute or to try to like argue over what the best plan of action is, and then the assessment that follows that. We're just giving them a negative counseling. We're sending them on their way. We're not giving them any tools. So ipso facto, your commander, you commanders and first sergeants are more involved in the administrative wheel, and we spend most of our time on the 10%, right? The 80-10-10 rule. We're spending most of our 10% on, or 100% of our time on the 10% of our low performers, and we're not even giving any credit to the people that need it, which is the 80 percentile. 10% of them, they're fire and forget. We don't even need to say anything to those people. But our 80% of our population is a population that you owe those people, those soldiers, most of your time. But we spend most of it on people we're not even going to retain. And I think that once a soldier gets on that path, we create more of them. We create more of them. So I just wanted to take a moment to try to use kind of what's in this, this way up, falling up, and then try to apply it without doing anything different. Don't add any, I started thinking of like a good idea fairy in the sergeant major's head is bad, because then I'm going to start asking for stuff on the calendar, and that's bad. We shouldn't do that. We should use something that the Army already has, which is counseling, which we already have carved out time for, and then just redirect it to where we use some of these learned principles into that conversation. Last thing I'll leave you with is, don't ever let a metric go untouched, right? Because as leaders, we have some of these little metric points, right? We have the CRRT. We can see when a soldier has high finances now. Like, we can see when a soldier has a speeding ticket. We can see what comes through the blotter. We can start asking those questions early without asking everybody, if they're okay. Because like, if you tell me I'm okay, I'm going to tell you to get out of my office. And a lot of people will retract when you tell them that they're okay. But if you have something on them, and you find something that they've done, now they owe you a conversation, and in that conversation you can find a lot of stuff, right? And just for an example, and I don't know if my first sergeant's here, but I had a soldier that came to us that was not supposed to come to us. And he got a traffic accident, and in the water I looked at the previous history, and there was things in there that were like, I'm pretty sure he was going to go to prison for beating his spouse. The evidence was so clear that they were back to Fort Campbell, and they should have never been back. This is something that should have never happened. If it wasn't for me looking at those data points and then bringing the soldier in and talking to that soldier with their chain of command, and we went through this without knowing it, we stopped the crisis from happening. So I think like if we spend more time doing this, we'll have less, you'll buy back that time to talk to the people that actually want to fight more. So sure, if you got any comments, we're going to move into discussion questions.
Okay, really appreciate the council. I think that's one of the #1 things that I took away from this. And it's a great example of the Tetris effect, with a negative slant being a positive thing as far as that soldier coming in. Like, let's say, I do not want to turn off the Tetris effect because it has all kinds of positive benefits in the organization. Some of the things that I really took from this chapter is the post-traumatic growth. I had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of going to grad school shortly after coming back from employment. I went to a pretty liberal school, and I remember like every time I stumble into a conversation where it became clear that I had been in the Army and that I had gone to war, how their natural assumption was that I was broken. And it really pissed me off, because I was like, I don't need your pity. I actually feel sorry for you, because I listen to the things that you find troubling and causing you all kinds of strife in your life, and I think they're laughable. Because I had gone through things that were tougher than that, and I find these small little things that you're talking about to be below even the threshold of noticing. And I think that ties to this whole thing about whether or not you're a person who thinks that a negative experience is just this all-consuming and you're just going to spiral down. I also like in this whole thing the whole approach to failure. Because if you haven't realized it yet, you will soon, that the whole Army is designed for you to fail. Are you guys all tracking that?
It's the way the whole thing is designed. Like, we are constantly going to put you in situations that are beyond your capability. We talked about designing the training to push them and to get them to the breaking point and have it happen. Because failing is part of growth. But it really is about he talks about explanatory style, we'll kind of get into that. But it's also just the perspective that failing is temporary. Failing is about development. And that's really the conversation to have with the soldiers. It's not to ignore failing. It's not to not put them in situations where they are going to fail and design cream puff ex-eval lanes. You are supposed to push them to the point where they break. It's going to happen whether or not you do it by design or not. They are going to fail, but it's the conversation internally and with your subordinates of like, hey, this is great. This is what was supposed to happen. I expected you to fail at some point. I didn't necessarily know what you were going to fail in, but I knew that you were going to fail. But this is by design because it's supposed to help you develop. As soon as you, we've all gone through this, as soon as you get good at your job, what does the Army do? It moves you. It's like the Army is not set up for you to be successful. Otherwise, they would say, like, hey, this guy's pretty good platoon sergeant. We're just going to leave him as a platoon sergeant and let him do the next 10 years as a platoon sergeant. That would be if we were after success, but we're not after success. We're after failure because we believe, while not the most gentle, failure is the best teacher, and it's how we're going to learn. And just kind of pivoting that. JRTC got brought up. I actually have some issues with JRTC because if you read the chapter, there's the trained helplessness of the dog. So the dog gets shot, and the dog just gets to the point where it doesn't even try to avoid the shock anymore because it just accepts the fact that it's going to happen. And that's what I believe JRTC has transitioned to. It is the punch in the face, punch in the face, punch in the face. We just rekeyed this Op 4 element that you were successful on so that you can get punched in the face again tomorrow. We just made it impossible for you to actually execute the plan that you came up with because we knocked you off the terrain that you had. We just put this artificial constraint in that made your fires ineffective. And unfortunately, I think in some cases, you watch it, and only through sheer professionalism do you overcome it. But it'd be really quick to say, why bother planning? I'm going to spend 2 days on this plan only to not execute this plan because we're not going to have the fires, we're not going to have the combat power, we're not going to have the terrain, the enemy's going to do something completely wazoo. What's the point? I said we're all professionals, so we fight through that whole thing. But I do think that there is a certain amount of that for like developing and training helplessness. Are there examples in garrison where we have trained helplessness and have allowed ourselves to kind of just be overwhelmed by it?
I think a pretty obvious example from the logistics side is maintenance. I think it's very easy for soldiers to feel helpless. I think we train a lot of our soldiers to feel helpless because they just see like an endless line of vehicles and over the course of time, that kind of just leads to lower productivity. I've seen one method to kind of alleviate this is to you have to give them a light at the end of the tunnel, and that's their reason, their kind of purpose is that day to work hard. They just believe that this, once they work on this vehicle, this is going to be another vehicle, they want to do that. So one thing that I found in the past is, like I said, so giving either a week's worth of work or just each day, giving each maintenance team a list of tasks, and then whether or not they fix all those vehicles, make those repairs early, they go on. I think when we first started doing this, we undershot the workload, and we sent all of our teams home at like 1,400, 1,500. I mean, it almost killed me. But once we kind of dialed in what the appropriate workload for the team was, and they all understood that if they got the job done, they can go home, as opposed to just bringing another truck at 16:30. After about a month or two, we actually started, increasing productivity and fixing more vehicles than before. I think that light in the tunnel is always important.
once we've trained helplessness, then people just quit. And they quit putting effort into it. And then you're, like, even if it is an impossible goal, you're certainly not getting there if everybody believes it's an impossible goal, because they're not going to put any effort into it. So finding those little things. Another seemingly simple one is the soldiers who just can't do the 4x36. And we just get into this situation where they end up just convincing themselves that they're helpless and they're never going to do it. So the real danger of it is they need to quit trying to develop strategies and working towards actually accomplishing their goal. I mean, having a guy run a 4x36 over and over again when they're not passing it probably isn't us putting the adequate kind of thought into how do we do it. We start having the guy do 2x18s. We start having him do a 4x40, and then just start getting it so that he doesn't feel like he's never going to get there, or she's never going to get there. And she can start working towards incremental goals where she actually does it. The other one that I find, and I'm guilty of it, and I know most people in this room are, is the whole or predictability rule. Does anybody feel like predictability is something that we can control, or are we largely helpless to?
I do, and maybe I'm the outlier, but I think you can control it in terms of, I'm not going to tell you every day what you do, and I'm not going to be able to tell you every curveball, but I can tell you the direction we're going and where we're going to be by the end of this quarter or the end of this training cycle. That's the predictability. This is what we're growing after. You may have hiccups, or maybe tidal waves that come in every now and then that disrupt that. But in general sense, I know where I'm going. I know what I'm doing.
And that's just a slight difference to what most people feel, but it's the difference between being helpless and feeling like you have some ability to control it. I've talked to some of the company commanders about you get into this whole thing where like there's no predictability, and that leads to I'm not even going to bother to plan training because I've planned training, I've planned this X eval that I wanted to do 3 times, and each time something's come up that's caused me to have to cancel it. It's caused me to like forego the land. Now I have this ammo. So what's the point of me bothering to design this training, resource the land, resource the ammo, and actually build like the books for how we're going to evaluate. And I've talked to them about like, hey, like, if you take that approach, then you're just going to quit. And I'm not going to tell you that we're going to be able to fix it. I'm not going to be able to tell you that it won't get canceled the next time. But there are little things that you can do. And I've talked to them about instituting inside of a company formation white, black, gold at your level, where it's like, hey, listen, I'm going to have a platoon that is doing nothing but taskings. And they have no reasonable expectation to expect anything else. And I'm going to hit them until we have hit all the soldiers in that. 36 soldiers, then until I have 36 taskings, then I'm not coming off of that. And that may mean the platoon leaders handing out towels at the gym. Maybe it comes to that. But then the person who's in the intensive training window or the green cycle now actually does have predictability because he can reasonably assume that they're not going to get through the red platoon and the amber platoon and get to me, so they can actually do it. So it's not a huge, significant thing that's going to change the world, but it's saying like, okay, at my level, what can I still control? I'm not helpless in this. I can design little things, whether it's moving in a general direction, we need to be flexible on what day we execute it, or it's like, no, because I have to lock in land and ammo, it has to be on this particular day, and I'm not flexible, so as a result, everybody else is going to pay the price, and I wanted to take the whole company out, but instead it's going to go platoon by platoon. And I'm going to rotate my platoons through this red, amber, green cycle so that I can do it. So it's just fighting that sense of helplessness and figuring out what things you can control and how you can make the best of it. It's not ignoring the fact that it's not good. Predictability is not where we want it to be, but it's not being helpless and actually figuring out what you can do to kind of change it. And then you talked about counseling too. Unfortunately, I do a significantly more of this than I've ever done in my life, of career-ending counseling. So you talk about like the ABCD or whatever. And so when I have an officer or senior NCO that comes into me and I'm basically the event, the A, is career ending. Like there's no way to kind of get around that. Like this is going to separate you from the Army. There's no real survival in this. Then the belief that they end up coming into, it's the whole like, my world is ending, my career is over, this, that, and the other. Then it's just having that conversation of like, hey, listen, this is still temporary. Like, there's no doubt about it that this DUI or this domestic violence is going to end your career in the Army. But don't mistake that for it's going to affect what's on your gravestone. Like, you're 25 years old, you're 30 years old, you have talent, you have skills, you have things that are marketable out in the civilian world. It's really just providing perspective is what the whole C and D is. And it's like you were talking about in the counseling, that it's like taking the time to sit down and put the thing in perspective. Yes, the event happened, your belief is this is permanent and this is all encompassing, and then just trying to work them through, whether it's an AAR for squad sticks or career-ending counseling, showing them that this is a temporary thing, that is not the end of the world, it's not going to affect what's on your gravestone. Now you just need to take advantage of this opportunity the best you can and learn from it, and now start generating your path.
Go on to the next principle or easy test on your AIM resume. I think most of the leaders in here, I've never interviewed someone familiar, but Brock 6 probably has, or probably has, or some of the DCs, probably comes up to interview. I know some sergeant majors probably sit on the board, they probably have to pass your career and see how many times you failed, right? And that's probably put them on the spot, evaluating some self-awareness there. Like you have failed, you know, you're a captain in the Army, you failed, you're in the States, you failed. Tell me when, what you learned from it, what do you do to prevent it next time, protect the way. So I think that comes out in the interviews.
I think it's useful also to leverage the time that you failed in doing that counseling and find like an actual, like the one that you are the most frustrated by or from you, or you might be embarrassed by, that you have still grown from, in order to show people that you don't have to catastrophize, but that you can actually come back, right? Like I had the privilege of doing 5 years at West Point because I got in trouble my last year and I had to do my senior year over again. And there are plenty of people that have done, well, not a lot of people have done it, but most people that have done that, they approach that last year as like, I'm just waiting until someone tells me if I'm gonna get out or not. I tried not to. I had some good mentors that helped me with that. What that meant is when I got to go back and teach, and I had students that were like, they failed at something, I could look at them and say, like, look, I'm not a captain, I'm a major, and I fucked up real bad. And you can still, like, if you leverage these things, you can still be successful. It doesn't have to define you. But if we just say, if we minimize those things, or if we try to keep our failures like in the back where no one sees them, then we can't use them to help other people do that post-traumatic growth.
So there's a city brigade commander in the 101st who did 5 years in prison.
Yeah.
So there are success stories. And pulling back to John's comment, if you're getting ready to get interviewed and you haven't thought through your answer to an example of where you failed and what you learned from it, you need to. Because that is probably the #1 question that you're going to ask in the interview. And don't throw out the negative and actually just a couch positive. Like, go ahead and go hard in the paint. This is where I failed. This is what I took away from the experience. Because it is one of the questions that is basically like the #1. You want to Google, say, questions for an interview, it's going to pop up. One other thing, if you want to help people fail up, there's this truism that experience is a requirement for development, but experience is not enough for development. And substitute failure for experience, because most of your most meaningful experiences were failures, if you're doing it right. But the role of leaders and people in this room is that when there is the failure, you have to have the person make meaning of the experience. So it can't just be the experience and then the development. The missing piece in there that has to be there is the making meaning and some of your soldiers, and you guys have done it, where you do that on your own. But it's much more helpful if someone who's more experienced, someone who wasn't in the moment, can help them kind of work through what happened, why it happened, and then how they could have potentially prevented it. So definitely invest time in that if you're not already. When you do see those failures, once again, don't ignore the failure. I don't want these rose-colored glasses. The trick is to understand that it's temporary and it's a growth opportunity, not the end of the world. I've had to fire people in this job. I've never fired someone for a tactical mistake, embarrassing mistake. It's always been a incompatible leadership style or some kind of criminal activity. So just working with your soldiers to understand failing is what we expect. But what we also expect is for you to learn from it, and my job is to help you.
Okay, hey, so acknowledging that we got just over 60 minutes left, we got 3 principals to go, so I just ask that every group following just keep their discussion to around 20 minutes to top out, please. Bathroom breaks, if you gotta go, just stand up, go, stretch your legs, but we're just no more organized breaks. We're just gonna keep rolling through the rest of these principals.
Through Zoro Circle, locus control, whether it's internal or external. We talked about failure and things that we've had to learn. Like, this is something I've had to relearn throughout my career. And like, I've had to ask, I've said to myself, like, I'm just a lieutenant, like, I'm just a captain, I'm just a major, like, I'm just a battalion commander, like, what can I do about it? We're gonna get into a bit of a discussion around this once Major Whippy kind of explains the principle behind it, which is relatively simple and straightforward. Because I would suggest we struggle with this here in the division. We sat in this very room and listened to my peers and myself complain about, you know, all the things the division is screwing up and how that's impacted us. And I'm just struck by the moment, saying we do spend a lot of time complaining about all the things the division is doing to us, and not a whole lot of time about how the things that are within our control we can act on. We'll lay out the principle, and then we're going to pose back a simple question to everybody else, and then ask you to help us think through it.
Major Whippy, so the Zorro principle, the concept of the entire chapter is that happiness and success are more prevalent when people feel in control. So when Zorro was learning to sword fight, his master drew a little circle around him, and he wasn't allowed to leave that circle until he was a master within that circle, and then slowly expanded. In the book, they give the example that's a little bit more realistic of a student that was overwhelmed by the messing up of their room, and it was affecting their performance in the classroom. So the author goes over to help him out. And he doesn't start by just saying, clean the room. He goes to the desk, points out a corner of the desk, and says, let's organize this pile of papers. So they organize the pile of papers, and then, you know, students like, where do we go to next? He's like, tomorrow, defend this space. Then after the end of the next day, that space is empty. He's mastered that corner, and then they move on to the next corner of the desk until after a series of weeks, he has a clean room, is able to continue. That's the overall concept, and then some factors to look at is the locus effect. That's simply the degree to which a person believes that their actions impact the outcome. You have an internal locus and an external locus, and they kind of go hand in hand. The internal is that you believe completely that you are in control and your actions impact the outcome. You see this a lot in post-game interviews with a quarterback or key player, where they start, I wasn't reading the defense right, I was mishandling the ball, I didn't have a good grip, the refs were making a lot of terrible calls, the sun was in my eyes, it's really windy out there today, so that's just kind of the duality of how the two work together. So we'll take a couple minutes, we'll break back into groups by battalion, and we'll just kind of go through the same exercise that the author goes through with one of his examples. make a list of the things that are stressors on your organization at the time level, separate them into things that you do have control over versus things that you don't have control over, and then identify your Zorro circles, things that you want to get after the most, and then how you expand it from there, and then how it correlates. That it's not that cut and dry where the Army as itself is conditioned to be kind of a more external focus where constantly blaming the echelon above. So being mindful of like everybody wants to think that they can influence force com at the time level, but like what can you actually control and like where do you want to start and like, how does it expand? So we'll give you like 2 minutes to separate back into those groups, and then 7 minutes for discussion, and we'll 1 minute get back in here and we'll go from there.
I'm going to come around by the time and ask you guys for just a minute or so to kind of talk about 2 things. In the first question, and we'll go question 1 and question 2 by team, and then we'll start with Red Knights just so you guys kind of see at least how we took it, slang at it, and then everybody else will get their chance. But the first question I have is, do we have a locus of control challenge? And this is kind of building upon some of the other discussions, like, hey, have we had failures in the past? And so like a perfect example for me is sitting in here in a division command session and just kind of thinking to myself and hearing other members of the team just talk about the challenges that the division has. And the division does this to me, the division does that to me, the division doesn't give me any predictability. At some point, like, we have to establish control, I think, within our areas. And then so the second question is, how do you or how can you apply the Zorro Circle to yourself and your organization? And so those are the 2 questions I asked my team, and so those are kind of the questions I'm going to ask you guys to speak to. So first I said, do we have a locus of control problem? And the first person speaking was Taj. Tell everybody what he said.
Hello everyone, Captain Master with Gator 6. So the one thing I brought up was pretty simple. You see a soldier who is not within AR 16-1. Do you walk by it or do you stop and say something to him or her? And one thing I've noticed is a lot of people like, that's not my problem, but it is your problem. So if you're letting that soldier come in, and I'll just go there, hair out of regs, nails out of regs, not wearing the correct earrings, what standard are you then setting for that soldier to follow? So you're letting them get by with the small stuff, but then I'll trip into things like, is that soldier coming in PT? Is that soldier taking care of their finances? So when we walk by stuff, we are creating that problem that we say is not our problem. In reality, it is our problem.
We're relinquishing control. And then Don, you had something else you want to talk about, the locus of control?
So I was, what came to mind was last February, as a lot of you remember when we were on CRF and everything started happening in Europe. My reaction at that time as the Battalion 3 was to like, oh, we need to start getting the S2 to work up these like Russia briefs and like we need to get all this like stuff going on. And then Colonel McEwen kind of focused back in like, no, we need to focus on like readiness and the stuff that we can control. And so my mind went to like, we have to find some kind of balance where you have a recognition or awareness of like what's going on in your external circle, even though it's outside your control, while you're focusing most of your energy on the internal circle. So that's kind of what came to my mind for how I handled it within the brigade recently.
So a challenge that we're kind of wrestling with in the battalion is our barracks, and I tried to talk to our soldiers about areas of control. So I tried to fit it into things that are, okay, what is free? It's easy, really easy to control things that are free. And then we described it in terms of resources, how much would it cost to this, so $500 or less or something like that. Tried to put circles around it. So we moved forward in discussion to, okay, we have some challenges with locuses of control, and whether internal, external, and whether we relinquish them, how can we start to apply this to ourselves here within the battalion, the battery, ourselves. So we just started with ourselves to reestablish potentially like an internal locus of control. And Mike was the first person to speak up. You want to tell us what you said, Mike?
Thank you. The biggest thing I said was cognitive versus emotion.
we can control a lot of our emotions, and we can definitely leverage some of the negative emotions that our soldiers sometimes output to us when we ask them to go conduct a task. But as long as we don't fall into that emotional pitfall, we can adapt or steer the ship correctly to where we can meet successful, to become successful at our tasks and objectives. Another piggyback off of what Rock 6 said about like 4x36s. Let's say we have soldiers that are constantly failing 4x36, maybe because that soldier isn't running every single day. Maybe if we just tell them, hey, let's master 1 mile a day in this inner circle, then we move on to further and bigger things. That way you build the crawl, walk, run phase for that soldier and try to help them out that way.
So we started with ourselves and establishing control of our emotions, and then what that kind of the energy that moves out back into the organization. And if you can't control, at least to be aware of the emotions that you're putting back out into the organization and the team that you lead. So the next circle we talked about is battery level, or the company through battery level. So we had some thoughts on at the battery level things we control. So you guys want to tell us what you said? That's the right nights. From messaging. Okay. So communications.
The climate of that organization.
Yep, you got a lot of control over the climate.
Recognition.
Yeah, who you choose to recognize. Like who you choose to take that time to recognize people, who you choose to recognize. And then we started to broaden that out once we established control at the battery level, things we could do at the battalion. What are you guys' thoughts on the battalion level?
Providing the perspective, sir.
Yeah, perspective, which is exactly like what Major Irwin talked about. And we talked about time, again, like the apportionment of time and how we control some of the time and what we use time for. Some of it is out of our control, but we do have some time at our level that's within our control and how we use that. So just a quick demonstration of what we're looking for. One, do you experience challenges with locus of control, and then how can we start to apply this Zorro circle to ourselves, to our formations? The other teams we heard
So for us, really the thing that came out was this idea of ownership, and just like Tosh talked about, ownership at multiple levels, and we're firm believer that the people closest to the problems are the ones that have the best ideas on how to fix it. So we had some thoughts on that. Mike, can you talk about what you said about him and Todd talking about the SEO?
Yeah, that's true. So one thing that we've been kind of refining and running into, not issues, but some obstacles with as we continue to plan out our training creation is training resourcing. I'm sure we've all dealt with some frustrations with land, ammo, air, all that good stuff. And since I've been in the AS3C, that's really what I've been focusing in on and trying to figure out. And what I've come to realize is it's pretty easy for us to just blame the system that exists currently. Like we can disagree with how the resource allocation conference works. We can disagree with how ammo authorizations are based off the SRAC and all that good stuff. That's really just looking at it from an external levels of control perspective, that these systems are set up for us to fail. Whereas once we start to take ownership and realize we need to operate within these systems, step one is understanding exactly what the processes are. Step two is starting to abide by them. Once we can take ownership of that and internalize that locus of control, that we need to operate within the systems rather than lament about how the systems are set up, that's when we become more successful in our ability to accomplish our jobs.
Yeah, so through several sensing sessions, one of the biggest takeaways from soldiers, they want the barracks improved, and they don't understand the process. So it's at the battalion level to develop that narrative, and then control we can within our internal locus of control. So we can't change the barracks overnight, we can't build new barracks for the soldiers, but we can effect some things at our level. So a huge initiative was leader involvement, leader engagement, NCOs in the barracks and whatnot. Well, for the staff duty officers, part of their closeout is run through an A. All right, so they have a really great habit of identifying a problem and then just pawning it off on someone else to solve it. So now we have put that onus on the SEO to identify a problem and then develop a solution in an end state to fix the problem. So their next tour of duty in 30 days is they back brief on how they've solved it. So whether it's a broken urinal, they make sure the work orders, in place and they follow through. Or, there's laundry that's stolen in the barracks continuously. Well, the recommendation is for security cameras. All right, great. All right, so run the trap on how much these security cameras cost. Let's start working what we can affect at our level on getting those funds to
in place security cameras in the lunchroom. So again, so it's just incremental changes over time, and not changing the culture overnight. We can't shift everything by X, Y, and Z, throwing everything at the problem, but we can affect those incremental changes over time. So that's what we've been doing in the various initiatives.
Awesome. So two great, easy things to point at. They could easily say, hey, like that's way out of my hands. Like training resources, like that's division, installation, I can't touch that. Or the barracks, it's gonna take like 10 years to create new barracks, like there's nothing we can do about it. There absolutely are things you can do to start to establish control at your level to make some change potentially. Any other teams want to take a shot at it?
So I think as far as like Zorro's circle is concerned, we kind of start talking about marksmanship and how and that we also talk about grade inspection. It's this big thing that's coming out that we've been hearing for a while. It seems very daunting at first. And one thing that I think has helped was we're getting kind of broken up into different working groups. And by default, we kind of broken that up into 2 meetings a week that we hold. It's called to go out to grade readiness, like a brief run A and run B. We do like 3 different periods each thing, just to kind of like make not see so much overwhelming. And an output from those meetings are like, hey, these are the small things we're going to get done this week, and we're going to report on it next week. Another thing that we started talking about was we started talking about metrics. Now I'll turn it over to Captain Crafton.
We kind of said with everything metric related, we wrapped up in the CRE and the old front, but we get really away from the function level of actually doing the training and influencing where that number is coming from. Doing the training and then giving ourselves credit for it, and then on the back end worrying about where the reporting is coming from and making sure that that is correct. But we like skip steps, worry about the number before we know that we've done the training, we've done a week control inside our circle for it to reflect through the system later.
The BSB team, we were talking about how the BSB has that unique task of not just having to do the same thing that everybody else has to do in terms of going out to the ranges, making sure that we're qualified, but we also have to support everybody else's mission at the same time. And so some of the things that we identify that we can't control is everything you are all asking us to do. So all of those last minute requirements that come down that are important and are absolutely part of our job, but that we can't necessarily program for. So what we did talk about is where we can make elbow room within our own systems. And that comes down to, we talked about troop to task, we talked about empowering junior leaders so that we're not, so it isn't the same person doing the same thing all of the time and having all of that responsibility. We talked about time management in terms of carving out, using spaces like PT to do things like awards presentations or just talking to soldiers versus finding another time where we have to pull people off task as a big group where they could be dividing up for other things. Did I miss anything, guys?
So those of you, I'll turn to Rock 6 for any closing thoughts on this one. My experience for grad school was similar to Rock 6's, but different. But something that I found was a lot of like Army leadership doctrine. While the science may not be there in the doctrine, it is there. You have to dig into like academia, and so to draw that back to like a very simple example here, like you talked about locus of control and kind of some of the science behind it. We do this, if you remember back at LTPA, hey, what's the brigade fight? What are the battalion fights? And you start to pick out what are the things that I have to have an impact on, and what are the actions I need to take to support the bigger picture or smaller picture. But we do this in our doctrine all the time, so don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I'll be brief on this one. I mean, the Zorro circle is nothing more than a how do you eat an elephant. Don't look at the little elephant, look at it one bite at a time. You just kind of work your way through.
Whether you're talking about preparing the brigade in the Army for LISCO, whether you're talking about systems writ large, whether you're talking about predictability or discipline, each one of those starts to feel overwhelming. So it's just about figuring out a smaller piece of it and just crushing it. You talk about discipline and all the different issues we have with discipline, or we perceive that we have with discipline. Don't start trying to solve the large discipline problem. Figure out a couple of key standards that you are going to zero in on and you're going to crush. And whether it is uniform appearance, whether it is the condition of the barracks, whether it's trash in the area, pick something small, crush it. It starts to become automatic for your soldiers, requires zero more attention from you. Pick out the next one, crush it. Becomes automatic, you don't have to put any more energy into it, pick the next one, crush it. So it's just about picking small, manageable things so it doesn't appear overwhelming and crushing it. LISCO, we're going to worry about marksmanship. We're going to worry about individual soldier proficiency. And then the Army naturally transitions you through training. So now we can focus on squad and what in particular squad are we going to crush and just crush it. Focus on the small manageable pieces, and the bigger thing stops being overwhelming because you're focused on a much more manageable thing that you'll have success on, which will just breed more success.
Excellent. All right, team, so if you've never met me before, I'm Nick Blake, I'm the XO for 21BB, coming in for Lieutenant Colonel Burns, who's got it for me. So one of the principles that we're going to talk through is principle number 6, which is the 20-second rule. Again, going back to very similar construct for the book, it's the idea of using positive psychology of kind of reframing and reiterating what your circumstances are, and then using that to change your outlook on whatever the circumstance, the situation is that seems to be affecting you both mentally or as an organization. In the your upper right, upper left-hand corner, 3 improvements, so physical and mental health, the relationship with your organization, and then internally your social and relational, both at the organizational level and kind of at the individual, right? So 3 primary impacts that kind of changing the way you view a problem, the situation, how it impacts it positively as a person or organization. Some of the sub-points we see, so again, the principle we're talking, principle number 6, that 20-second rule, goes a little bit back to somewhat of the culture and the socialization of us both as individuals, as an organization. So humans generally over time have evolved to try and look at ways of being more efficient, right? Time matters to us, so the use of time, the way that we measure our use of time, when we measure our effect, stack ourselves, mentally or unconsciously against another individual, are all different ways that we're socialized or built in as part of our cultural experience. So one of the ways that we do this is we try and look for those paths of least resistance. And that's really what this principle is designed to maximize, is look for ways to take your desired behavior and make it more accessible to yourself as an individual or as an organization, because the more accessible it is, the more likely you are to actually use that behavior or continue to build that behavior and allow it to contribute over time. So some of the key takeaways I had kind of at my level, so desired behaviors and decisions, we have to make them easy to perform for the individual or for ourselves as a leader. We need the time, patience, repetition, and consistency, because those are the formulas that build habits. If you don't take time to go through those 4 steps, you don't really build a habit. What it means is it's a short-term fix, right? All of us have seen this kind of at the organization level. We have a leader that comes in, maybe they're looking at transforming the organization. They're using our transformational leadership style. Well, it takes time, right? They build over 2 years in the position. They leave, everything they put into place gradually breaks down and falls apart because they're dependent completely on them and habits that they have built, rather than building those habits on the side of the organization. We look at willpower and decision making as a finite resource. Again, we know first thing in the morning, all of us come in hard charge, we do our PT. Within the first couple hours of meetings, you're already mentally starting to burn out. And then you get a complex problem, a lot of decisions you have to make, and you just don't really feel like either A, making the decision at that time so you pawn it off, or your organization, you've already used the amount of willpower and brain power you have for that day. Alright, so it's starting to look at when you need to make key decisions throughout your day. Does your battle rhythm support it? Are you individually taking the time necessary to recharge before like a key meeting, a key decision point? So as a leader, you're able to basically utilize the resources you have and make an intelligent decision that's going to benefit your organization. Then last, looking at simple rules. How do you put like simple things in your life that help you to overcome individual or organizational inertia? right? So simple rules we have, we do PT from 6:30 to 8, right? That's a simple rule that the condition is put in play, which allows us to get past the initial inertia of, do I want to get out of bed and go work out in the rain, right? It's a simple rule. Some things you can put at the company level, some things you put at the individual level, some things we organizationally force upon you. That's how do you use simple rules to make decision easy to free up your willpower for some other decision you have throughout the day. All right, I'm going to be turning it over to my team. So as you can see, this is kind of the breakdown we're going to talk through. Our section was broken into multiple little subsets, about 2 to 3 pages each. So company commanders, they'll talk through what did they take out of that section, is there any way they think they can apply it to themselves, and what were their takeaways or recommendations, and then Major Ed in our S3, and Sergeant Major will tighten it up. Any questions before I transition from here over to my team? All right, Captain Dormley, so go ahead and open it up.
Okay, I'm Captain Dormany, Samurai 6, and I'm going to just be going through this whole thing, common sense is not common action. And so this chapter, he starts transitioning into less of the why and more of the how. It's very practical. And he red hats himself right away. And so it's a tale as old as soldiers, right? He is briefing at some sort of seminar. Someone raises his hand, sharpshoots him by saying, hey man, this is all common sense. Like, what are we doing here? And he comes to find out later from that guy's teammates that the guy is actually perceived as a toxic leader, that he's not a team player. And so what he's left with is, okay, I've got this guy who is challenging me saying, hey, this stuff is easy, why are we talking about it? And then he turns around and doesn't practice it. And so then we get this term, common sense is not common action. And many great philosophers, spanning from Aristotle all the way to G.I. Joe, are talking about like knowledge is half the battle. The other half of the battle and the decision maker in this sense is like how does it get applied into action? How do you set yourself up for success? So you're not just knowing things, you're actually doing things. And this kind of applies in all parts of our lives. Like New Year's resolutions, like how many people have started a new week, knew them, they're going to get ahead on their emails, and then the week gets ahead of them. Well, why does that happen? And it tends to be because the habits aren't in place. Our instincts aren't trained yet. And so this chapter and the rest of these sections are essentially strategies that you can implement so that you're taking things from like knowing that they're right into building those instinctual habits so that you can chew gum and talk at the same time. And then also teach, coach, and mentor your junior leaders into applying these things to their own life, having got ahead of how they're going to red hat you, right? Like, what is the point of this? And again, the point of this is that you can know things, you can know the right answer all day long, but if you're not putting it into place, then what's the point of being here? So with that, I'll pass it off to Captain Strong.
Captain Strong, Shogun 6. So a lot of this book talks about making small changes or doing small actions, and then you see the results as it propagates over time. Same thing goes with forming good habits and then making those good habits into a routine. So you put in a little bit of effort every day into a good habit that you're trying to establish for yourself, and then day by day, it requires less effort because it becomes routine. It just becomes something that you do. So like, you know, kids take a lot of effort to just brush their teeth, right? It takes a lot of effort from kids and parents to get somebody to brush their teeth, but you do it every day. So that by the time, you know, we're at our ages, it doesn't take a lot of willpower most of the time to get up and just brush your teeth. Same thing goes for like other, you know, different types of habits that you're trying to form. So, you know, another example, you know, make a habit of in the evening, you know, if you pack your breakfast, and then in the morning after PT, you're not rushing to the shop to get tornadoes. You got something a little better for you, a little more nutritious. And so then that becomes a routine so that you don't have to put so much effort into actually getting that done. It reprograms your brain into, instead of, you know, I have to do this, that it's just something that you do. It's part of your routine. So then Captain Schultz,
Dan Schultz, Kuma 6. So I covered the section how the author described how he wanted to learn to play the guitar. So his goal was he wanted to play the guitar each day for 21 days straight. He set up the tracker on his wall and would check each day that he played the guitar for at least an hour. At the end of 3 weeks, he had only played the guitar 4 times, and he was pondering to himself why he failed at it, even though he set up that tracker that you would see daily. He kind of equates later on, one of his mentors, I believe his name was Tal Ben Shahar, told him a story that when he was a child, his mother made delicious chocolate cake that every one of his friends had a slice, but he refused because he was training for a national squash championship. Later on that night, his willpower gave out, and he went to the fridge and ate the whole remaining cake. So he just goes over to how willpower is just not enough for us to progress. We have to implement control measures. We have to implement peer support groups. So just a quick show of hands. Who set a New Year's resolution for 2023? Quick show of hands. All right. Who has kept your resolution so far? All right. Stronger willpower than mine. All right. Mine was, one of them was like, I gotta stop, eating fast food. All right. My truck is currently in the shop in Hopkinsville, right behind the Toyota collision center there. I had to go there, make them physically put into the bay because they've been putting me off for at least 6 weeks now. Unfortunately, right across the street from the auto shop is Chick-fil-A, God's Chicken. Love me some Chick-fil-A. So I talked to them, they said they would move into the bay because I saw it sitting out there in the lot. I'm like, all right, I trust them, but I'm going to verify. So while I waited, I was like, all right, I'll just run across the street real quick, give me some God's Chicken, and sit in the parking lot. Halfway eating through my, Gillette chicken sandwich, it hit me. I'm like, well, I failed my New Year's resolution right there. All right, my willpower wasn't there. All right, so the rest of my peers in the 21 BEB will explain a little bit further on how to build upon that willpower. And then with the BSB, with the 7th principle about building that social interaction and that peer support.
Camp LT, 3-6. So like you said, he talks about the willpower, and our willpower is the ability to control one's actions and whatnot. So that willpower we often look at as having a positive impact on our lives sometimes, to pause ourselves from doing that as some sort of negative habit that we may have. And as the author goes into to describe that, the problems and successes of the willpower, that willpower, like you said, can take taking the guitar out of the case to start playing the guitar. Put yourself in with the 20-second rule to screw this up here. The author, he describes himself as taking the guitar out of the case, taking the batteries out of the remote control to present or to remove the ability to go into those easy habits, right? So over time, he comes home and now he doesn't have the remote control on his couch to turn on the TV. He has his guitar. He started taking it out of the case. So he's done those 20 seconds, and he's taken that initial first step of willpower to put himself and move towards that positive habit. But in addition to that, additional decisions that we make in our lives every single day, whether it's what we want to eat for lunch, what we want to do on our agenda, that willpower is a finite resource, and that decision-making, we reach decision-making fatigue. And so an additional study that he goes in and talks about, he has 3 groups. The first group has a plate of cookies and a plate of radishes. And he says, you guys can't eat any of this. Group B has the same 2 plates in front of them, and he says, you guys can eat whatever you want, whether it's a cookie or the radishes. And then a third group with nothing at all. So they take the time, they sit in that room. Each group is all independent of each other. They're looking at the plates. Like I said, the first group, they can only eat the radishes. Second, eat whatever. Third group doesn't have to. After some time in that room, they go and solve what he calls a simple puzzle. Right? We all know through the studies throughout the book that simple puzzle was actually impossible. And so at the end, the first group to just give up was that group that had to resist themselves from eating those chocolate chip cookies. So the takeaway is that through willpower and through decision making, it has a toll and it plays a tax on our brains and everything that we do. So the takeaway that I took away from it was that willpower in and of itself, yes, it is a step in the right direction, however, it is not the ultimate solution to change a habit.
Captain Ellis, Viking 6.
So in the section that I covered, the author essentially talks about the path of least resistance, right? So he talks about how in supermarkets, they'll put like the most expensive foods and items in your face right there so you don't have to reach for them. That way, you're just gonna walk in, you're gonna say, well, this one is the one I'm gonna get. I don't have to, put forth any other effort to get anything else. I'm just gonna grab this and leave, right? Not the best idea, but it is the one of least effort. Same thing with cell phone companies, right? They provide you, hey, as soon as you're trying to buy this cell phone, here's the best plan for you. Even though if you do research and some other stuff, you could probably find a better plan, but because you want to, just go in and get it without providing, putting forth much effort, you're just gonna get that plan, right? It's the same thing with like, I don't know, like buying a car, right? So when you go in and let's say you go do an oil service, right? And someone comes to you, they're like, hey, I see that vehicle that you have, you're already here. I'm gonna sell you a car, right? They're gonna give you the car that matches that vehicle. You don't absolutely need it, right? If you actually do some research, if you really wanted a car, then you can probably do that. But they're gonna give you the best plan up front that they think you're gonna go for because they know for a fact if you leave the dealership right now, you're probably not gonna get the sale, right? So the path of least resistance, I think just applies to me, right? Army says, hey, you only have to be a signal officer, to be a major, you only need to do 2 years of battalion S6. Bada bing, bada boom, you're done, right? Why would you decide to take command? I choose to take command on top of being an S6, right? Because it's more rewarding to me, right? More effort, but comes with more challenges that's more rewarding to me overall, right? How do you apply this principle to your formation? I've met plenty of soldiers that says, hey, I'm a specialist. I'm just gonna, rock out as a specialist until it's time for me to get out. Why would I do, why would I try and be a sergeant? It's more harder, more effort. It's not, same thing, right? You just have to give that. We talked about giving someone ownership, responsibility. Give them ownership of their craft, responsibility of other people, and then they will step up to the plate, and more than likely, they will move into that sergeant rank. That's pretty much our section. Next person will be Captain Guthrie.
Captain Guthrie, Dust Road 06. So the path of distraction was really about this guy that he's always at work, he's never working, and it creates anxiety throughout his day and throughout really the entirety of his life just because he's always leaving work thinking there's something else he needs to do. But when he's at work, he's checking his email, he's checking stocks, he's checking all this stuff, and then it ends in a perpetual cycle where he's constantly checking his email, he's constantly checking the news, constantly checking stocks, and he's not actually getting work done. So the solution to this was the 20-second rule where you make a distraction where checking the stocks, checking all that stuff, make it 20 seconds harder for them to do. Or if it's a good thing, you make it 20 seconds easier for them to do. So then you build these efficiencies and then you increase your work productivity, you increase your time at home, and then you lessen your anxiety. I think this is pretty easy to do at the company level and even lower than that, even above that. We have to identify those distractions that we have that take us away from work, whether it be for the company level, like a meeting that does not have an output. Maybe we need to identify those meetings and not have them. Or if it has a meeting and it has an output, then make it very productive so the whole company can progress and move forward with that. Bottom line is we have to identify the distractions, make them harder for us to succumb to, and then identify those efficiencies and capitalize on those.
Good morning, I'm Sean Scally, I'm the ECHO FSC commander. So my portion of this was more about establishing barriers to negative patterns within your life. So just like Ethan just talked about with that 20-second rule, the author goes into how he was watching too much TV. So every time he'd get home, he'd sit down on the couch and he'd just watch TV for hours. So what he did was he took the batteries out of the remote, put them in the kitchen, and by establishing that separation between the ability to just turn on the TV and then having something else there that he wanted to learn, like the guitar or his laptop to knock out a few things on self-development that he wanted to do, he actually stopped watching TV and started grabbing the nearest item. And so I found this, like, for a lot of this stuff, I think that we personally, you don't have to take like the large principles, you don't have to reconfigure your life, But in order to actually institute this into our formations, we as leaders are going to have to start doing some of these things. Because otherwise we can't go into our formation and be like, hey soldier, you should do this, but I don't. And so I saw this one as a simple thing where I can go, okay, I want to start doing this. I want to start doing that. And then you can start applying, okay, I have a problem here, just like AA, first step to fixing your problem is you have a problem. I have a problem here, so I can separate myself and create a barrier between me and this problem, so that way I can go make room for other things in my life that I want to do, self-improvement, growth, whatever you want to input there. So that was my big portion. I'll be followed by Major Rendon.
Yeah, how you doing everyone? Major Rendon, solid 3. So just to kind of close it up, sleeping in your gym clothes, I'm not advocating for everyone to make their PTs their PJs, but there is something to that. Sleeping in your gym clothes is the whole thing about reducing the time of task to 20 seconds if it's, 20 seconds if it's a good thing, or making it 20 seconds harder if it's a bad thing. So how many people here at least like lay out the PTs or set out their uniforms the night before? So that's great on an individual level. Now we need to look at how can we bring this to the organizational level. So one thing is maybe HR metrics. One of those things we could do before they get delinquent is when people are in processing, I got my checklist of all those HR metrics. Let me get ahead of them before they become more delinquent, because when they're delinquent, you get a whole bunch and it becomes a whole lot harder. Next thing is set rules of engagement. So when you're creating a habit, that's the whole kind of point of this 20-second rule, is creating habits. And when we're doing a task, you lay out different things. So you have your TE and O's that you have. Those are kind of your habits that you need to do, your rules of engagement. So you have to do them. As discussed earlier, that initial inertia, that's the hardest part, starting that New Year's resolution. What are some of the rules that Akuma 6 could have done? Hey, I am only going to maybe carry $5 worth of cash, because if I go get fast food, I won't be able to get as much. I go there, I'm like, oh, now I have to think about it. Just certain different things. Now, bringing that to the organizational level, anyone have any thoughts on how that they can bring those rules of engagement to create change in their organization with rules of engagement? Anyone? No?
Yeah, I think a good one was like, at least in my company, we were having issues with like soldiers being on the ABCP program, and they don't always have access to healthy foods they claim, right? So they go over to the shop vet and they grab something to eat, because it's the path of least resistance. It can take less than 30 seconds to go over there and you get tornadoes and a piece of that box of that fucking whatever pizza that everybody's eating over there, and then they're getting fat, right? So I would always say, hey, go over to the DFAC, it's healthy, it's cheaper, why aren't you guys going over there? They're like, well, we don't have cash. And so needing to have cash is just an insurmountable barrier to being able to eat at the DFAC, right? But now, finally, in 2023, you can eat at the DFAC with a credit card. So now there's no more barrier, right? That barrier is now reduced. So I think that is increasing soldiers' ability to go over there. And I've actually had less soldiers on ABCP now by like 70% less, like since that changed. I don't know if that's a correlation or not, but that's pretty cool. Just removing those barriers.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome. All right, and then the last thing is, it's all in the shoes. Going back to that 20-second rule. So if you're sleeping in your gym clothes, got everything ready, the only thing you have to do when you wake up is put your shoes on. So as discussed earlier, all the decisions and the obstacles that we have create mental stress, physical barriers. So reduce the amount of things that you have to do prior to that decision, and it'll be easier. So wake up, got to put my shoes on. So going back to the HR metrics thing, 30 days out, hey, I know this person's become delinquent in 30 days. I already have the system in place. They go to the S1, fill out their DD93, confirm their SGLI. It's good to go. One less thing to do. But it's creating those systems and habits prior to that decision, so that way it's easier to do. Overall, Principle 6, the 20-second rule, it encompasses all the previous principles. You can see that build-up slowly coming, and then Principle 6, that 20-second rule, is kind of that accumulation of the previous principles. So just the fulcrum and lever, Tetris effect, falling up, and the Zurl circle. Sure.
Great. So this is one of my favorite chapters. I didn't use the first 200 pages to kind of conceptually sell me on this. The video did that in 12 minutes. But what I like about this one is it really shows you how to put it into practice. Because that's what it all comes down to. Like whether you buy into it, whether you're not buying into it, if you can't put it into practice, none of it is any good. I'm also a huge believer that repetition leads to a habit leads to it being automatic. The nice thing about something being automatic is it takes less mental energy, it takes less leader energy. And whether you're talking about soldiers looking for positives, it's going to catapult them into the prefrontal cortex and cause them to be positive, be more engaged, and be a more effective soldier. Or you're talking about LTT, or you're talking about enforcing standards. Because we all want junior NCOs to enforce standards, but we seem to be struggling on it. If you start having them do it repetitively, it'll become a habit, and they'll start doing it automatically, and it'll take less of your energy to do it across the board on every one of those things. I'm also a big believer in living proof that people are inherently lazy. There are multiple things that make me happy. I tend to do the one that is the easiest. And he talks about just sitting on the couch rather than going and doing something. But I mean, it is true. The easier of your habits that make you happy is the one that you're going to default to, even though it may not be the one that causes you the most enjoyment. And I equate this back to what are the two most common comments on a DEOC survey? I read a lot of them. Predictability, it's probably number 3. In here, in our unit, may move up, but generally speaking, the most common comment you get is I stand around sitting for the word, or I sit around waiting for the word, right? And then the other one that you always get is I never get a chance to train my soldier. Newsflash, those two solve each other. And I truly do believe that soldiers would have more job satisfaction if they were getting trained more and they weren't sitting around waiting for the word. And I do believe that our junior leaders and even more senior leaders would have more job satisfaction and be happier people if they could spend more time training their soldiers. But it comes down to what is easier. Sitting there and pulling out your phone and waiting for the word, or actually, and that is some enjoyment, or actually training your soldiers. So we need to figure out ways that we can make training soldiers and being trained as a soldier easier than pulling out my phone and waiting for the word. Because I think in every formation, we're all guilty of that. So how can we do that? I mean, do we put whiteboards up across the battalion and company area to make sure that there are dry erase markers, not permanent, dry erase markers, so that a NCO, we show them, this is what you can do with your free time. You can talk movement formations on the whiteboard. You can talk crossing an LDA. You can talk reactive contact. Providing areas and showing them examples of taking soldiers out outside of the barracks, outside of the company area, into that open field, and walking them through battle drills, walking them through individual soldier tasks. Can we make getting into the arms room easier so they can draw their weapons out and do battle drill 6 alpha inside of the barracks? They can do walk-through, talk-throughs, or reactive contact with their weapons out in that open field. Can we gobble up more local training area and show the soldiers that we own already everything in the rock playground, everything behind the air assault school, and everything on the far side of Maybury Road to kind of make it easier for them? We've made it so hard to train because we've got 8-step training model, all 10 steps of it, and we've created this perception that they need to go through all 10 of those steps to actually go out and train, and start removing some of these impediments to them going out and doing that training. But I really challenge you all to kind of look at it across your formation and understanding that soldiers complain about waiting for the word, and soldiers complain about not having time to train their soldiers. Recognizing those two solve each other, and then figuring out how to remove all of the things that make pulling out my phone and looking at my phone and figuring out how many likes I have is harder than actually just going out and training your soldiers in one form or another. I think some of it comes down to them not understanding that training their soldiers can be nothing more than a whiteboard talk about some part of their job, or just sitting there and having a conversation with them, as opposed to the great distractor, which is your phone. Just the simplest thing and simplest form of enjoyment that a soldier can get, and make training as simple as that.
Close this out real quick with social investment. So, bottom line up front, a bunch of smart people from this century have been studying other smart people, and they've come to the conclusion that relationships matter more than anything else in the world. So I kind of want to open this up. What does this mean? What does it matter to you? And if so, which relationships do you value the most? So as we kind of go through this, just kind of think on that in the back of your head. So, again, going back to the study that's almost been a century long now, despite anything, race, religion, politics, gender, socioeconomic statuses, it doesn't matter. The conclusion still comes to be the same thing. Now, down in the third point there, we have biological need for social support. So real quick, just kind of shoot from the hip, anybody out here, does anybody socially invest in negative or positive people only? And what are the risks and effects of that? Anybody? After reading the chapter, do you find yourself investing more positive or negative?
Captain Brown, sir. I say positive people, but I also lean towards really somebody who's competent in an area that I might need help in. So generally positive, sir, but then if somebody also knows the negative sides of something that I'm needing some social help on, then I'll talk to that person too, because then they can provide that information as well.
Sir, I prefer to then you'll get fucked up.
I think what the author's trying to get after in this point, like, to socially invest, if you see that one negative person or you see that one positive person, if I see a positive person, I'm going to socially invest in that person. So being in the military, we kind of have a pretty cool situation where we have a professional and we have a personal. And it's really getting down to the squad level leaders saying, hey, look, professionally, you go up and down, you go vertical and horizontal, right? So I know for my staff, I give them all counseling. The first thing I make them do is go find out who their BSB equivalent is in 1st Brigade, 2nd Brigade, and then cross it to BSB. Why? Because we all accomplish the same, we all do the same thing, we all have the same problems, we all have different ways of approaching it. And building that social network has proven dividends in getting a lot of your faster responses. So again, going back into it, the author, he does the firefighter test, and then just going through a lot of different examples in there. But the main thing I really want to hit on right here is back in 2013, I believe it was, I remember distinctly sitting down with my battalion commander, and he did a counseling with me because of the suicide and spikes and everything else. And he sat down with me and he's like, hey, pretty much what Roxic said at the very beginning, what made you join the Army? What makes you tick? And then as we got into this discussion, going back into spouse, family, friends, colleagues, all these different influences where even though they might be different across the board, what makes me tick, we have a commonality on this. And it sheds a perspective that we would not otherwise have. And I know we got 1 minute left, so I'm going to turn it over to Major Williams real quick to close it out on the last one.
What does it mean to cooperate and graduate? Who's heard that phrase before? Okay, so will someone say it out loud? What does it mean to cooperate and graduate?
Sharing is caring.
Okay.
So, working together, you can either work together towards a common goal or help each other out so that that person can succeed, and maybe they'll help you out another time and help you succeed, but sharing is caring.
Yeah, that's great. There's another way to think about that too is, we're only as good as our weakest link, right? So if someone is failing in our organization, they're going to do nothing but drag us down, but if we all wrap our arms around that person, then we can all get better. When we think about how we can leverage that social network, right? That's the big part of it. It's that cooperation part. Not just what are you leeching out of that social network, but what are you doing to invest in it? How are you reaching out? I got a question. Do you have to be physically present to be a part of someone's like support network, support structure? Okay, talk to me about that.
I mean, most of us don't live next to our families anymore, I assume. A couple of things opposed to, but for the most part, who looks at family, friends, colleagues, people that like, if all the cards went down and you got fired tomorrow, do you have a place you go sleep if you lost everything? I know that for a fact. Like, if I lost everything today, I've got 9 siblings. I can call any of them, and my life would be just fine. Right? And so, like, I see them twice a year if I'm lucky. But it's a huge reason I'm able to get up in the morning, because I have that experience.
Captain Gavay, when was the last time you reached out to someone not to ask for help, but just to be proactive in engaging with them?
The last time I did that?
Can you talk about it?
Last time I reached out to someone to be proactive. It was probably like 2 weeks ago, and it was 1st Brigade.
Okay.
Talking to their Delta FSC commander, just seeing how things were going with like they're getting ready to go, and that's how I found out that they were going to need a little bit of help in drawing some ammo and stuff like that. So it kind of played out in a good aspect. Little did I know I was setting myself up to offer help, but I guess just reaching out. Sometimes like it's just to say, hey, how are you doing? Other times it leads to more. So
That's great. When was, because someone else mentioned a time where they told someone not, hey, how can I help you? Or how can I take something off your plate? But like volunteered, I'm going to take X thing off of your plate. Can anyone think of a time where they did that?
I mean, oftentimes when they get in a command team with like commanders and you bog down with something, I'll just tell them I'll handle, X, Y, Z or PD slides if that's so busy. I think the top 3 typically work together fairly well to accomplish those types of tasks without having to ask questions.
Okay, that's great. I'm mentioning these things. The book talks a lot about what we can get out of our social network, like how we can use that to help make ourselves successful, to make sure that we're not isolating ourselves. But what it doesn't necessarily, it touches on briefly in terms of like, hey, write an email, tell them people thank you, and that's great. But in order to really build up that support structure, we need to make sure that we are investing as much into it as we are taking out of it, right? Because otherwise, if you're the one that's just leeching from that, then you are going to wind up isolating yourself, and you're going to make this problem even worse. They talk at the beginning of the chapter about the one student who just, it was the part of the semester where everything was getting really rough, and they like locked themselves in the library, and you can just imagine, many of us have been that student before, right? Like, I'm not going to eat because that's going to take up time. I'm not going to sleep because that's going to take up time that I could be studying, and I'm not going to talk to anybody because that. But that person winds up struggling and catastrophizing and collapsing and leaving, right? Versus the other student who is being proactive and not just seeing what other people can do for them, but how they can help other people and invest in them in order to make everyone around them more successful. So especially looking at this audience, right? The field grades in the room, the company command teams in the room, right now we should be thinking not just of how can I get something out, but also what can I invest into both the networks in the company, but like our SFRGs. What are we doing with the families? Are we checking on them? Are we waiting for something to go bad to make sure that that system works? Or are we going to invest in that system ahead of time so that when something goes bad, we've already got our arms wrapped around that person? Sir?
Okay, so this is another chapter. I got mixed feelings on it. But at the end of the day, I'm glad you mentioned the SFRG and just the families in general. We can, and I'll get to it, the Army side of this, but that's one of the areas where you talk about someone who's potentially going to be under stress, that's going to need help and need connections. If we deploy, you're talking about a group that is more likely to be isolated than the people
uncomfortable at work just because there's forced interaction with us just through doing our job. So I tell people all the time, like, hey, SFRG, some people have very allergic reactions to them, and I'm perfectly all right with that. I just ask that you come, because what you may find in common with somebody else is that you hate the SFRG, because there's going to be a couple of you that you do. And that is the only connection that needs to happen. Bam. That person hates the SFRG too and thinks they're a total waste of time. We have that in common. Then that spouse ends up in crisis, and that spouse has somebody who they know, who they have something in common with, they can reach out. If the only bond they have is hating the SFRG, then the SFRG was a success. Because now they have that connection, they have someone to kind of rely on. So, kind of transition to this, like, there's the whole support side of these social connections and everything else, and I'm all for that. But there's also the side of it about how it can help you at work. We talked about Charlie Battery struggling with qualifying. If Charlie Battery just goes in, the commander sits down and tries to solve the problem, he may be able to solve the problem. He's not going to solve the problem as well as if he brings in other battery commanders that have gone through the same thing. He reaches out to somebody senior to him and starts getting their advice, someone who's been through it, somebody who's been successful. Reaching out to the NCOs that have probably gone through this a number of times and have probably already identified the 6 things they're doing wrong. They were just waiting for somebody to ask them. So that's kind of the social interaction. We bring the company commanders in, we start talking about ITN fielding and problems they're having with the radio. One person's further along than the other person's getting ready for that training event. That person's sharing that experience and that social connection now jump starts that, keeps them from having the same problem that the other person has. Somebody else might have already had the solution and they start sharing that. So we need to figure out how we can form these connections and better arm both ourselves and our subordinates to do this. We used to do, when it was back in Sergeant's time, we used to do the low density MOS, like pooling together. And I don't know if we're doing that, but I mean, if you're doing LTT, bringing all the supply sergeants together, either at the battalion or the brigade level, now puts all these people in. Yes, they're building some social support network in case they're in crisis, but it also gives them somebody who's going through the same thing. And this company supply sergeant has got a good system for this, but is a train wreck in something else. Over here, this person's figured out what that person's sucking on, but is struggling with the things that they're doing good on. So it's figuring out how we can kind of leverage the collective intelligence and experience of the group is really what you're trying to achieve here. Because you may have the smartest person in X group, but that person isn't as smart as the collective is. So this whole chapter for me is about how do we build those connections so that we can leverage the collective strength and experience and intelligence of the group instead of relying on individuals. Because as under stress, we all kind of have a default to just zero in and focus on the problem and try to do it ourselves, rather than kind of expanding the leveraging the collective experience of the group to actually solve the problem. You'll end up with a much better solution. That's the last one.
Yeah, that's the last one, sir. Just real quick, before I open it up for closing remarks, thank you to all the battalions for putting this together and then facilitating the dialogue. Speaking of social investment, I think we've got our new brigade chaplain in the back of the room right now, Major Boyles. Raise your hand, please.
No,
Nice to meet you. Like, huge investment right there. Great source. So just shake his hand on the way out. Welcome into the Rock team. We'll re-rack these slides and then push them out to you so that you all have them. And then PAO, I just asked that you package that video so that we can all have access to it. There is a short TED Talks film about 12 minutes long. We've got it pulled up on the internet. So if you want to watch it on the IMAX screen, give us like 35 minutes after this is all over with, and then we'll push play. You'll have that opportunity. From the back rows, are there any closing remarks, comments from anybody? No? Any of the battalion leadership? Okay, sir.
All right, so first off, we went over 10:30. I apologize for that. Eagle Tribe time goes to 11, so I don't feel too bad. If you do have to break away, I'm not going to be offended. Probably apparent that I'm pretty passionate about this. I've bought into it, and I really think that it does have a tangible effect. Like I said, there's the kind of social science side of it, but there's also the side of it that actually has like hard science behind it as far as like the being in the proper part of the brain and then what you can do with it. The number one reason I kind of pushed this and wanted to do this in this forum is I talked to staff duty, I've talked to company commanders, I've talked to small little isolated elements about this. And some probably are taking it, some aren't. But I really believe that I'm probably the most irrelevant person inside of this brigade. So like if I do this stuff, I'll be a marginally better brigade commander. I won't be a good brigade commander, but I'll be marginally better than the kind of the substandard place I hold right now. But the real power of this and the power of every organization is getting it down to the lowest levels. What makes the Rakkasans great is not the leadership. You see you see hundreds of leaders come through this organization, but the Rakkasans have always maintained. You've got the Colonel Steeles, the ultimate football coaches, you've got the General Brzezinski. But you've got all these, you've got the Cogbills, you've got the T's, you've got all these different people, they all have different personalities, but the Rakkasans don't change. There's still a bunch of raving lunatics who will do anything that you point them at. So the power of this isn't in you kind of adopting this and you becoming a better leader. The real power of this is if you can get this down to the individual soldier, then you start harnessing the collective power of 4,400 people. And if 4,400 people are hanging out in their prefrontal cortex because they're in a positive state of mind instead of hanging out in their limbic system, you will have problems identified and solved long before they become your level. So that's, to me, the real power of this, is getting it down as far as we can and harnessing the power of those 4,400 soldiers and getting them focused on the proper thing. It'll have the benefit that I was originally looking for, where I think it'll improve morale, I think it'll improve people's mental health. But the real power of this is just getting all of those people focused on accomplishing the mission and all those people properly primed to identify and solve problems, because I'm not going to make the Rakkasans great. 4,400 raving lunatics are what's going to make the Rakkasans great. Okay, so I'll stick around for this video. If people stick around and watch it, there's certainly no obligation, and I don't mind sticking around as long as people want to engage or talk about whatever they want to talk about. But appreciate you guys coming.